The story of Eichstätt begins with a quiet gift. According to early tradition, Boniface entrusted the deserted place to the Anglo-Saxon missionary Willibald, so that it might become the centre of his work. At that time, almost nothing remained there except a small church dedicated to Mary, a fragile survivor from an earlier Christian presence. Around the years 740 and 741, Willibald founded a monastery on this ground, and from that modest beginning a bishopric slowly emerged. The land that formed the heart of the new community had originally belonged to a nobleman named Swidger, who passed it to Boniface, and from him to Willibald. This territory lay beside the Altmühl River, a waterway that connected Bavaria with the Frankish realm and served as an important route for trade and movement. The region was also known for early iron mining, and together with nearby Solnhofen, it had already shown signs of Christian life in the 7th century. Even before the monastery was established, a settled population and a basic economic structure were present. Political change soon followed. After the Bavarian-Frankish conflicts of 744, the northern Bavarian lands, including Eichstätt, came under Frankish control. Ecclesiastical organization accompanied this new order, and during Willibald's lifetime, the monastery was elevated to the status of a diocese. Its borders remained uncertain for many decades, yet by the early 750s, it was recognized as part of the Frankish church system and placed under the authority of the Archdiocese of Mainz. With Carolingian support, the institution strengthened, and around the cathedral grew the residences of the bishop and his clergy. Gates, chapels, and churches appeared, including a shrine that later received the relics of Saint Walburga. The cathedral district became a protected zone with special legal privileges, an area where the church exercised rights, normally reserved for the king. Like other medieval bishoprics, Eichstätt gathered its identity around holy figures. Willibald and his sister Walburga were honoured as the principal patrons, while other early missionaries remained in their shadow. Over the centuries, their family members were also drawn into the circle of veneration. Such saints gave spiritual authority to the bishops and helped justify their claims to temporal power. The cathedral cities of the early Middle Ages were imagined as reflections of Jerusalem and Rome, sacred spaces ringed by monasteries and canonries that formed a spiritual wall around the bishop's seat. These places were centres of worship, learning, and hospitality, but they also became administrative hearts of the territories that gradually developed around them. Compared with larger episcopal centres, Eichstätt grew slowly during the 11th century. Bishop Heribert founded the Benedictine convent of St. Walburga on the site of an earlier church, and a men's monastery arose on a hillside to the northwest. Only in the following centuries were additional houses established by Irish monks and the Dominicans. Yet even modest shrines attracted pilgrims and settlers. Town life began to form in the shadow of the cathedral as people sought both protection and opportunity near the holy precincts. In southern Germany, many of the earliest towns grew in this way around bishops' seats. The shaping of the diocese continued through neighbouring monasteries. Heidenheim, founded in the early 700s by Willibald's brother Wunibald, eventually came under the control of the Eichstätt bishops and was transformed from a monastic house into a community of canons, increasing the church's wealth. In 888, King Arnulf granted the noble monastery of Heriden to Bishop Erchanbald, who reorganized it and transferred much of its property to Eichstätt. These acts clarified the western border of the diocese and created a circle of dependents who owed military service to the bishop. Royal favour brought further rewards, including the monastery of Kirchenhausen in 895, which Erchanbald dissolved in order to strengthen episcopal authority. The growth of the diocese thus involved not only parishes and churches, but also the creation of vassals and the assertion of judicial rights. Such independence could survive only with royal backing. In 908, Erschanbald received from King Ludwig the rights to hold a market, collect tolls, strike coin, and fortify the town. These privileges transferred former royal powers into episcopal hands. A few years later, King Conrad confirmed all major possessions of the church, including forests and distant parishes, as well as the immunity that protected the cathedral district from outside interference. From this moment, the bishops of Eichstätt held both spiritual authority and worldly lordship. In return, the rulers expected service. They sought influence over episcopal elections and relied on bishops to provide troops and hospitality. The closeness of Eichstätt to the royal court varied. Some bishops had served in the royal chancery, while others appeared only occasionally in imperial circles. Reginald attended important ceremonies in Italy, and in 981 he was required to supply heavy cavalry for an imperial campaign. Yet the number of royal privileges granted to Eichstätt remained small, and the foundation of the new diocese of Bamberg in 1007 even cost it territory in the north. During the Salian period, relations with the monarchy became warmer. Bishop Herebert owed his position to direct royal instruction, and the emperor and empress were admitted into the cathedral's prayer fellowship. The king hoped that a loyal bishop would balance the power of ambitious Bavarian nobles, who were expanding their influence as ducal authority weakened. Imperial assemblies forced these nobles to return lands they had seized, and the Bishop of Eichstätt was meant to serve as a counterweight in the region. Gradually, the bishops accumulated more rights over forests, markets, justice, and fortifications, and transformed their seat into a true sacred city. Royal service did not always require the presence of the king himself. Eichstätt rarely hosted the monarch, yet it was obliged to support his officials and journeys. One story tells of a royal servant who arrived claiming poverty and was welcomed at the bishop's table, only to be punished when his deception was discovered. Another episode describes heavy demands for provisions to be delivered to Regensburg, which the bishop reluctantly met by surrendering valuable cloth produced in the town. These incidents reveal how burdensome the obligations of service could be and how uncertain their limits were. The later 11th century brought the turmoil of the investiture contest. Bishop Gundekar, appointed through royal investiture in 1057, had been consecrated in the presence of the future Pope Gregory VII, at a time when harmony between crown and church still seemed natural. As conflict grew, Gundekar sought a middle path. He compiled a great book that celebrated the traditional unity of kingdom and priesthood, presenting the history of Eichstätt's bishops and honouring its saints. The work expressed loyalty to the old imperial church, while quietly resisting the new claims of the Reformed papacy. Gundekar even styled himself Bishop of the Holy Church of Eichstätt, emphasising the special dignity of his see. Throughout the crisis, the diocese tried to remain neutral, balancing respect for royal authority with awareness of ecclesiastical reform. Its relative political insignificance became an advantage, allowing it to avoid the worst storms that shook larger centres. Bishops and clergy sheltered behind their traditions and their saints, preserving a distinct identity shaped by centuries of gradual growth. In the lands around Eichstätt, power was never held by the bishop alone. Two noble houses, the Counts of Hirschberg and the Counts of Oettingen, acted as lay protectors and representatives of the church. This arrangement was not simply ceremonial. Church law forbade clergy from spilling blood, which meant that a bishop could not personally carry out executions or lead armed action in the field. Those harsh duties were handed to a secular official, the advocate who possessed a formal authority to act on the church's behalf. Over time, that office grew into something far larger than a legal workaround. Advocates could claim administrative influence, interfere in local governance, and limit how freely the bishops could rule. The bishop's own territory, often called the Hochstift, was split into two separated zones of control, an upper lordship and a lower lordship, and the advocates became powerful enough to threaten both. Tensions rose sharply in the late 13th century, especially in the upper lordship, where the Oettingen family had accumulated influence since around the beginning of the 13th century. They held important advocacy rights connected to places such as Heriden, Ornbau, and Leerburg, and they treated those rights as a platform for territorial expansion. The dispute came into the open when the Oettingen began building their own fortress at Ornbau, on land the bishop considered ecclesiastical property. The bishop responded by appealing to higher church authority, and soon royal power entered the conflict. A royal judgment favoured Eichstätt and demanded that the new fortification be dismantled. Even that did not end the struggle. The contest continued for years, shaped by negotiations, threats, and shifting alliances, until a settlement early in the 14th century finally softened the immediate pressure. Events then escalated again when an imperial ban was proclaimed against a leading count, creating an opportunity for the bishop to reclaim lands that had drifted away from church control. Royal confirmations followed, supporting the return of key possessions. Yet the count resisted with force, and the bishop had to rely on outside help ordered by the king to protect the repossession. The conflict did not simply vanish with one death or one document. Armed supporters of the count's family continued to fight on behalf of his widow, especially over a strategic castle that mattered not only for defence, but also for authority over surrounding villages and routes. The crisis widened when a disputed royal succession split the political landscape. The bishop aligned with one claimant, while rival nobles supported the other. Retaliation soon struck the region in a brutal way. A major settlement was captured and destroyed in a punitive campaign, then returned again under royal decision. The shock of that destruction finally broke the momentum of the opposition. The Oettingen and their allies renounced their claims, and a cluster of contested places, Heriden, Warburg, Ornbau, and additional strongpoints near Eichstätt, fell securely back under episcopal lordship. Later attempts to revive old demands were turned aside, sometimes with the quiet logic of legal decisions, sometimes through payments designed to buy peace where arguments alone would not. While the bishops fought to reduce pressure in the upper lordship, a parallel confrontation unfolded in the lower lordship with the Counts of Hirschberg. This was not a sudden quarrel, but a long struggle over how far a lay advocate could transform church protection into independent territorial rule. A line of bishops emerged who refused to accept Hirschberg ambitions as inevitable. Some sought support from the ruling dynasty of the empire to counterbalance local pressure, and that strategy came with its own cost. Closeness to the imperial court often required long absences from the diocese, and those absences could weaken daily control at home, even while strengthening political leverage abroad. The deepest roots of the lower lordship dispute lay in the changing character of Eichstätt itself. By the late 12th century, the inhabitants were increasingly treated as burghers, a status that set them apart from nobles and from dependents directly serving the bishop. Legal distinctions were mirrored by the town's visible form. Walls, a parish church, a market, and denser building all expressed a community growing into an urban organism. The town's layout seems to have been shaped deliberately, placed between the fortified cathedral district and the convent of St. Walburga. Even the religious geography shifted as the parish centre moved from a church near the cathedral to a Marian church tied to the marketplace, aligning spiritual life with commerce and civic identity. Royal privileges supported this transformation. A major fair, confirmed by royal authority at the end of the 12th century, was intended to stimulate trade at a time when older forms of fair activity had faded. Within a few decades, documentary traces point to a functioning market and substantial stone buildings, signs of a town taking on permanence. These urban ambitions also intersected with dynastic interests. One bishop belonged to the Hirschberg lineage, and the promotion of Eichstätt could serve two overlapping agendas: strengthening the bishop's town while also supporting the territorial project of the very advocates who were supposed to be restrained. In this environment, imperial politics mattered. A bishop who travelled with the emperor in Italy appears in the orbit of major constitutional decisions that reinforce the rights of church princes for generations. At the same moment, imperial protection was explicitly framed as a defence against aggressive advocates. A renewed market privilege was granted again, reinforcing the economic foundation of the bishop's seat and tightening the link between political authority and urban growth. By the late 13th century, fortune tilted toward the bishop in the lower lordship for a simple biological reason. The leading Hirschberg count had no heir. When it became clear the line would die out, major castles and advocacy rights began to drift back toward ecclesiastical hands. Strongholds such as Hirschberg and Salzburg mattered not only as military positions, but also as anchors for jurisdiction, village courts, and the right to oversee church property. At the same time, the bishops worked to recover rights that neighbouring nobles had acquired over time, including protective authority over monastic lands and control over church fiefs held by outside counts. The extinction of the Hirschberg line ended the most serious threat of a full takeover of episcopal territory, but the transition was not peaceful. In the final months before the last count's death, the bishops sought to secure the inheritance by formal charter, and the town of Eichstätt sided with the count. A major conflict followed, and even after victory, the church inherited heavy burdens. Debts accumulated by the extinct dynasty weighed on the bishopric's finances for a long time. Another obstacle remained embedded in the legal structure of the region. A high court associated with Hirschberg's former authority passed to the Dukes of Bavaria and handled the most serious criminal jurisdiction. That court represented a rival source of power. For the bishop's territorial development, it became essential to protect key towns from being dragged into external legal forums. Royal guarantees helped establish that Eichstätt and Berching should not be summoned away to outside courts, ensuring that high justice in these urban centres lay with the bishop. Compromises and arbitrations with Bavarian dukes settled some disputed lands and hunting rights, yet also acknowledged broader judicial claims held by the ducal power. Even so, royal backing could still shield Eichstätt from other threats. When an imperial official connected to Nuremberg claimed control over dozens of village courts in the Hirschberg region, a royal ruling supported the bishopric. The bishop's personal closeness to rulers, serving them as counselor, diplomat, and spiritual advisor, made such outcomes more likely and demonstrated how much depended on presence at court rather than strength at home. Inside Eichstätt, another institution increasingly shaped policy: the cathedral chapter. Over time, the canons came to see themselves as guardians of the church's rights and possessions, and their social background mattered. They were largely drawn from minor noble and knightly families of Franconia and Swabia, rather than from the Bavarian duchy. Their growing authority expressed itself in the right to elect bishops, a practice that took firm shape in the later 13th century. Candidates rose from the chapter's own ranks and were expected to accept binding conditions tied to the preservation of the bishopric's material base. The Hirschberg inheritance became a central obsession. Each new bishop had to swear not to alienate it. The chapter also protected its interests with careful documentation, assembling records of rights and privileges and creating inventories that fixed lands, incomes, and obligations in writing. For the bishops, putting possessions on paper was not merely bookkeeping. It marked a new territorial starting point and signalled alignment with the chapter's programme of consolidation. Historic memory also became a political tool. During the 13th century, certain claims were written down as if they had existed from the earliest days of the bishopric. These texts portrayed Eichstätt as holding special honours within the wider church province, including ceremonial precedence at synods and a privileged relationship with the leading metropolitan see. A distinctive liturgical garment was even presented as symbolic proof of this elevated standing. Yet these assertions did not truly belong to the earliest period. They were part of a later strategy, crafted to strengthen Eichstätt's position, in an era when ancient legitimacy could be converted into practical advantage. Territorial control also depended on stone and mortar. Castles were not only defensive structures, but also administrative hubs and visible declarations of authority. Bishops expanded their power by purchasing strongholds, developing fortifications, and forcing agreements that compelled noble castellans to open their castles to episcopal troops in times of conflict. Such castle defence arrangements mattered because the bishopric's lands were fragmented, and a chain of accessible fortresses could determine whether rule was real or merely claimed on parchment. In the late 13th and early 14th centuries, bishops acquired or strengthened a series of key places, expanding control around strategic castles, securing nearby villages to supply them, and reinforcing existing fortifications with walls and improvements. Administrative centres were protected not only by garrisons, but by controlling the surrounding landscape. Church patronage rights, village courts, and the small lordships that fed revenue into the episcopal treasury. As the 14th century progressed, more castles and fortified sites were added, towns were walled, and some fortresses were obtained through purchase or through rights of repurchase. Agreements with local nobles multiplied, binding them to keep strongholds ready for episcopal use. Later, bishops reinforced many castles and fortified towns belonging to the church, and repaired residences that symbolized episcopal presence within important urban centers. Political opportunity sometimes offered a tantalizing dream. A temporary pledge of a nearby imperial town briefly promised a land bridge that might unite the divided upper and lower lordships. That hope did not last, but it shows how the bishopric constantly searched for ways to turn scattered possessions into a coherent territory. Urban policy became just as important as military architecture. In fragmented lands, towns and markets multiplied, because rulers needed local centres of administration, trade, and control. Across many regions, bishoprics showed a pattern. The episcopal seat was usually the oldest urban centre, followed by additional towns that emerged during periods of expansion, and later by small frontier towns used as instruments of policy. Eichstätt followed this logic, though later than some neighbouring principalities. A first phase of intensification came around 1300, once the bishops had successfully weakened the two major advocate houses. In the lower lordship, Eichstätt and Berching were secured as core centres, and another market centre was added through royal transfer. In the upper lordship, important places were obtained from the hands of powerful regional lords, and the bishopric finally gained stable administrative and economic focal points in areas that had long been contested. Heriden and Ornbau, once battlegrounds of the advocate conflict, became key anchors for the Western upper lordship. A second phase unfolded in the later 15th century, marked by systematic economic and defensive measures. Annual markets were confirmed and coordinated. New markets were purchased, and former villages were elevated to market status. Regulations for artisans were confirmed more consistently, giving urban life a clearer legal framework. Defensive buildings surged again, especially in border areas vulnerable to neighbouring powers. Town walls and curtain walls were strengthened, and existing fortifications were improved across a network of sites that guarded both the lower and upper lordships. Yet even at its height, the bishopric was not the same thing as the bishop's secular principality. Throughout medieval Germany, a bishop's spiritual jurisdiction often stretched far beyond the lands he ruled as a temporal lord, and Eichstätt was no exception. The bishop's secular territory lay entirely within the broader diocese, but it never covered more than a fraction of the diocesan area. The strongest concentration of lordship lay along the Altmühl Valley in the lower lordship, while the upper lordship remained divided into separated blocks anchored by Heriden, Ornbau, and Spalt. Inside the diocese, many other powers held ground: a Margraviate, a Palatine region, an imperial town, a Teutonic order lordship, and numerous knightly territories. In the south, even a major Bavarian ducal town belonged to the spiritual bishopric's landscape. The result was a patchwork in which ecclesiastical authority, secular lordship, and neighbouring jurisdictions overlapped, rather than forming a single unified domain. Eichstätt's development, taken as a whole, is best understood as the story of a borderland. Its rise as a bishop's seat began early, but its territorial principality took shape primarily in the 13th century, in a region shaped by the presence of Bavaria nearby. Strong royal influence appears only intermittently, and as central rulers tightened their hold over Bavarian ducal power, Eichstätt gradually lost some of its earlier role as a frontier instrument. To preserve prestige, its bishops insisted on traditional honorary claims, connected to wider church hierarchy, even if those claims carried more symbolic weight than practical power. The decisive turning point was the successful struggle against the advocates, with help from the imperial dynasty of the age. Only after that victory could the bishopric move from defence to expansion, developing towns, strengthening markets, and building a usable chain of castles. Medieval lordship did not survive on castles and battles alone. Two quieter tools mattered just as much, sometimes more: the way property was passed on after death, and the way sons and daughters were placed through marriage. Neither of these choices belonged purely to the will of a single ruler. They were shaped by law, by social expectation, by the economics of household survival, and by the constant fear of dynastic collapse. In the early centuries of the German Empire, kings liked to present duchies, marches, and counties as offices rather than private possessions. In theory, the crown could appoint whomever it wished. In practice, the great families pushed in the opposite direction. They worked, whenever possible, to hand these positions to their own sons. Over time, that pressure changed the rules of the game. By the 12th century, a new normal had taken hold. If a ruler left a legitimate son, the son was expected to inherit. The king's free choice was mostly reduced to those moments when no suitable male heir existed. This early model still carried an older logic. Because a duchy or county was treated as an office linked to a fief, it usually went to a single heir, not to all sons equally. That created an immediate family problem. The eldest might receive the office, but younger sons and daughters still had to be provided for. The main resource for that was the family's private property, lands and rights not tied to the official fief. Families could distribute these holdings to satisfy the claims of the rest of the children, but doing so created a danger that never went away. The more children a couple had, the more the family's private estate risked being chopped into smaller and smaller pieces. Every generation could weaken the base that made lordship possible. To slow that fragmentation, noble houses became inventive. Some fortresses that had once been purely family property were deliberately turned into fiefs, because fiefs could be kept intact under certain rules and reclaimed under defined conditions. Other key properties were shifted into religious foundations, where they could be protected from being broken up by inheritance claims. In some regions, brothers ruled jointly to keep lands together. In other cases, families steered a son into the church, knowing that a clerical career often required accepting a reduced share of inheritance. None of these steps was purely spiritual or sentimental. They were practical measures designed to keep a lordship from dissolving into a patchwork. A major turning point arrived in the later 12th century and became common in the 13th. Slowly, lordships began to look less like offices and more like dynastic possessions. As that view spread, each son could argue that he was entitled not just to private property, but to a portion of the lordship itself. It was no longer enough to say, one son holds the office. Instead, the territory came to be treated like family property that could be divided. Some rulers tried to resist this shift by insisting that major lordships should not be split, but the political climate was moving the other way. Royal authority weakened. Ideas of private ownership gained influence, and families increasingly acted as though the land belonged to the dynasty as a whole. If a father chose to divide his territory among several sons, this could be presented not as a violation of royal order, but as the natural expression of family right. Even titles reveal the change. Under the older view, only the active holder of the office was normally called Duke, Margrave, or Count. His brother might be described simply as the Duke's brother, and his son as the Duke's son. As the inheritance model shifted, the title became a birthright. All members of the ruling family, including women, could carry the designation from the beginning of life. The language of office gave way to the language of blood. This transformation reshaped politics. Daughters rarely gained the same claim to rule as sons. Their rights tended to activate mainly when no male heirs existed. Sons, however, were increasingly treated as entitled by birth, not only to a share of wealth, but to the exercise of lordship itself. Marriage then became more than a personal event. It became a mechanism for multiplying ruling lines. Each son who received a share could marry, establish his own household, and begin a new branch of the dynasty. Fathers could not easily block those claims, because lordship was now justified above all through lineage. Only one path reliably prevented division: a son voluntarily renouncing his share. Yet persuading a second or third son to give up the chance to rule and to found a line of his own was rarely simple. By the middle of the 13th century, the result was visible across the empire. An age of partitions, with territories repeatedly split and resplit. The political consequences were dramatic. The number of ruling princes grew. A landscape once dominated by a smaller set of major lords became more crowded, more fragmented, and more fluid. Houses died out, branches appeared, and the map kept changing with every generation. In this environment, even a single dynasty could look like many different powers at once, depending on how its lands had been divided. A well-known example illustrates the complexity. One major ruling house controlled two large territories, acquired through different routes. one through royal grant and another through marriage. Over time, these holdings were partitioned among sons. Separate branches formed, each with its own lands and its own political interests. Sometimes, childlessness and untimely deaths reunited territories under a single ruler. Then, at the next major inheritance moment, division could happen again. In some generations, a single extended family might produce a surprisingly high number of simultaneous rulers, all technically part of the same dynasty, yet governing different fragments. From one angle, it remained one house. From another, it looked like a cluster of competing principalities, wearing the same name. Older historians often treated these partitions as a national tragedy, because they were writing with later ideals of state unity in mind. But that judgment misses the harsh logic that drove medieval families. The central problem was not ignorance or foolishness, it was risk management in a world where childhood death was common and dynastic extinction was a real threat. Limiting births to produce only one son might have kept a territory intact, but it was also dangerous. If the chosen heir died young, the entire line could collapse. For that reason, many noble couples aimed for large families. Having 10 or more children was not unusual. Yet, that success created a new crisis: how to satisfy the claims of many sons within a territory that could not survive endless division. This is where family strategy became almost ruthless. The goal was not simply to produce heirs, but to reduce the number of sons who actually inherited land and political authority. The only dependable method was to persuade younger sons to give up their share. But renunciation required compensation, and the compensation had to be convincing. A father needed to offer a path that felt equal in status, security, and honour to territorial rule. The church provided one of the strongest alternatives. A position in a cathedral chapter could give a princely son a comfortable life supported by wealthy benefices. Over time, that route could lead to a bishopric or archbishopric. In the medieval empire, some bishoprics were not merely spiritual offices. They carried substantial secular power and lands. A son who renounced his inheritance might still end up ruling a territory, only this time under the title of a church prince rather than a lay lord. Families recognized this clearly and treated clerical careers as instruments of dynastic strength. These arrangements were often formalized in written family agreements that laid down how the house would distribute power and property across generations. Yet the same era shows that strict primogeniture did not become the general rule in the empire early on. Even when certain leading territories were expected to pass to the eldest, rulers continued to plan divisions. A common pattern was to define an indivisible core and then split the remaining lands among other sons. The reluctance to enforce strict primogeniture had its own logic. Fathers often wanted freedom to choose which son would rule, and new branches, created by division, served as insurance. If the senior line died out, a junior line could inherit and keep the dynasty alive. Only much later, when war and political pressure threatened the survival of smaller territories, did primogeniture become widely accepted as a necessary shield against extinction through fragmentation. The same balancing act shaped the lives of daughters, though in different ways. For a long time, daughters could receive substantial shares in movable wealth and personal property, even if they could not claim offices or fiefs. Their dowries, however, could complicate inheritance. In many cases, what a daughter had already received at marriage had to be calculated back into the total estate before dividing shares among heirs. That meant family inheritance could become a slow, conflict-prone process involving inventories, calculations, and disputes over what counted as private property and what counted as a fief. To reduce conflict, a clearer practice spread from the 14th century onward. Dowry and trousseau increasingly came to be treated as an early inheritance. Marriage contracts began to state, in effect, that by accepting her marriage portion, a daughter surrendered further claims. These agreements were not just marital arrangements, they were inheritance contracts designed to secure stability. They usually kept one protective clause. If the male line failed, if father, sons, and brothers died without heirs, then the daughter's right could revive. This protected women from being displaced by distant male relatives, from collateral branches. Over time, however, many families tightened the rules even further. By the late 15th century, the preference for male inheritance was often extended so broadly that a woman could inherit only if no male member of the dynasty remained at all. The purpose was plain: to prevent land from passing through a daughter into another family by marriage. Religion could be used here as well. Families often offered a choice that made the economic logic clear. A costly dowry for marriage, or entry into a convent supported by a comparatively smaller annual pension. Becoming a nun typically required renouncing inheritance rights, and financially, this could be far cheaper than arranging a politically appropriate marriage. The price, however, was strategic. Sending a daughter to a convent removed the possibility of gaining allies through her marriage. A convent was not always a financial dead end for a ruling house. In certain settings, it could become another platform for influence. If a daughter entered a prestigious community and later rose to lead it, the family gained a loyal office holder in a respected institution. Over generations, this could become almost predictable, especially where a monastery functioned as a family foundation. In some convents, the list of abbesses reads like an extension of the dynastic family tree, because noble relatives were repeatedly placed there and, in time, promoted from within. Plans could even be written into family agreements. If future generations produced too many daughters, a portion of them would be directed into religious life. Behind the pious language stood a practical calculation: how to manage resources without losing status. The broader picture of princely family policy in the later Middle Ages follows a hard logic. High child mortality pushed ruling couples toward large families, because the extinction of a line was a constant fear. Yet a large number of surviving sons threatened the territory itself, since each could claim a share. The solution was not to reduce births, but to decide, often through pressure disguised as choice, which sons would inherit and which would not. Renunciation of inheritance, described as voluntary, became a key tool. The church helped make this workable. A clerical career offered security, prestige, and sometimes a form of lordship comparable to what a secular ruler possessed, especially when high church offices carried land, courts, and political weight. For daughters, the pattern was different. Their share was increasingly compressed into dowry and household goods. Marriage contracts were designed to close the door on later claims. And if there were many daughters, the convent offered relief from the enormous costs of multiple high-status marriages. In one famous painted representation of a ruling father and his children, the intended distribution of roles can almost be read from the arrangement. Some sons placed on the secular path, others in clerical careers, daughters divided between marriage alliances and religious offices, with an abbess standing as proof that a convent could also be a position of authority. Once inheritance had been managed, the second great instrument of lordship came into view: marriage. In principle, rulers had wide freedom to choose spouses for their children, provided they did not openly violate the law of the church. Medieval canon law forbade marriage between close relatives within a broad range of kinship, and this rule was generally acknowledged. Yet the same system also offered a loophole. Dispensations allowed marriages that would otherwise be blocked, and the frequency of such permissions reveals a pragmatic reality. For princely families, kinship was rarely a complete barrier. As long as the relationship was not extremely close, obstacles could often be removed with the right petition and the right justification. First cousin marriages remained unusual, but unions between more distantly related partners were treated as workable, especially when the political value of the match was high. The idea that bride and groom had to consent freely did not stop dynastic planning either. Families shaped their children through upbringing, expectation, and sometimes blunt pressure, ensuring that personal preference rarely overruled strategy. For the ruling class, marriage was less a private bond between two individuals than an act that joined two power networks. It took an existing relationship, whether friendly, competitive, or hostile, and raised it to a new level. Blood ties created through children were permanent and public. Contemporary language often described this new connection as a form of friendship, not in the modern emotional sense, but as a durable alliance. Marriage contracts frequently emphasize the creation or strengthening of this friendship between houses as much as the couple themselves. This is why princely marriage carried an openly political character. It could seal alliances, stabilize borders, or function as the final gesture that ended a conflict. Sometimes a marriage followed negotiations and served as proof that reconciliation was meant to last. In other situations, it was arranged to confirm cooperation between rulers facing a larger issue, such as a dispute that divided the church or threatened the empire's unity. Even religious authorities recognized the political role of marriage. Requests for permission to marry within forbidden degrees sometimes justified the match by arguing that it would end hatred and prevent violence. In that sense, the wedding was treated as a tool of peace. Marriage was also a pathway to land. The most direct method was to marry an heiress. Here, two patterns can be observed. In the first, the heiress status was already clear when negotiations began. The bride had no brothers, her father was old or dead, and the inheritance seemed inevitable. Such marriages could bring territories, titles, or major revenues into a new house through a single agreement. In the second pattern, no one could be sure at the time that the bride would one day inherit. A daughter might later become the key to succession because brothers died, or a male line unexpectedly failed. When such surprises occurred, an earlier marriage could suddenly transform a family's position, delivering lands that no one had expected to be on the table. These heiress matches also show how dynastic priorities reshaped personal considerations. In ordinary planning, rulers preferred young brides because fertility mattered. Families wanted many children as insurance against extinction. But where a crown, a rich county, or a strategic territory was at stake, age differences became less important. Chroniclers sometimes spelled out this cold calculation in blunt language, arguing that a father should not hesitate over age if a great realm could be gained. In extreme cases, young princes were bound to marriages with much older women because the inheritance attached to the bride outweighed every other concern. Such unions were not romantic scandals in dynastic terms. They were investments. Still, spectacular heiress marriages were not the everyday routine. Most of the time, princely marriage politics involved careful balancing of payments and status. A daughter's dowry could be enormous, while a son's marriage brought money or assets into the family through the bride's side. Ideally, rulers tried to keep this financial exchange circulating within a broader kin network. Reciprocal arrangements, marrying a son into one house while marrying a daughter into the same house, could reduce the net flow of cash, since obligations cancelled one another. Such paired alliances were pursued intensely, even though they also created denser political bonds and tighter kinship webs. A further variation appeared after territories were split between brothers. Once separate branches existed, marriages between those branches could keep wealth inside the wider dynasty. Dowries stayed within the same extended house, and if an inheritance later fell to one branch, the benefits still returned to the family as a whole. The price of this strategy was obvious. Repeated intermarriage made kinship too close for church law. But here again, dispensations offered a practical exit, and permissions became easier to obtain as the political logic was repeated again and again. Over time, this produced a strange problem. The more successfully rulers used marriage to bind neighbouring houses together, the harder it became to find a permissible partner. By the 14th century, members of the top dynastic circle could plausibly claim that almost every major princely family in their region was connected by blood or marriage. Petitions for dispensation sometimes describe the situation in long chains. An uncle here, a sister's son there, a brother-in-law in another territory, until the political map looked like one interlocking clan. In response, families began to formalize their expectations even further. Agreements emerged that promised mutual inheritance support and military assistance between related houses, tightening alliances in legal form. Not merely through wedding celebrations. Weddings themselves mattered as political theatre. They brought princes together in public, strengthened cohesion through shared ritual, and signalled unity to outsiders. All of this operated under a harsh financial ceiling. Entering the top circle of marriage politics required the ability to pay. Dowries scaled with rank, and for great houses the sums could be crushing. Debts and limited income meant that even princes struggled to gather cash. Payments could be stretched over years, and the convent once again appeared as a practical alternative. Sending a daughter into religious life could sharply reduce the financial burden, even for rulers proud of the alliances they had created through marriage. The decision was not always ideological. It could be accounting. Marriage also offered a way to control expenses by marrying down. A daughter matched with a lower-ranking noble required a smaller dowry, but this same logic ran in the opposite direction for sons. Families preferred to marry sons to equals or above, because the bride's dowry and the political prestige of the match strengthened the dynasty. The most valuable partners were foreign royal houses and the most prominent ruling families of the empire, those that repeatedly produced kings and emperors. When equals were unavailable, families tended to choose from counts and high lords, rather than the knightly class, which remained a rare option in princely strategy. Looking across the later Middle Ages, marriage patterns show a sharpening sense of rank. At the highest level, a small group of dynasties dominated the most prestigious matches. Others occupied a middle tier, and some stood at the lower edge of the princely world, where marrying beneath one's status remained more common. Over time, the trend moved toward stricter boundaries. The share of marriages contracted with royal or fully princely partners rose, while matches with lower-ranking nobles declined. This was not only about pride, it was part of a broader shift in political culture. The princes were increasingly separating themselves from the wider aristocracy and defining their own exclusive circle. Individual decisions reflect the same attitude. Even when a match promised enormous wealth, a prospective groom could reject it on the grounds that the bride hadn't been raised as an equal in princely terms. What mattered was not simply land or money, but a shared standard of rank and lifestyle. In that sense, marriage practices were not merely family affairs. Together with inheritance planning, they helped reshape the empire's political structure. They strengthened some houses, produced new lines through partition, narrowed the circle of acceptable partners, and reinforced the gradual transformation from a looser medieval order into a landscape dominated by defined princely states whose rulers claimed a constitutional role, special privileges, and a distinct social identity. Late in the Roman world, a new religious habit settled into Christian life. The dead were not left behind in silence. Communities prayed for departed souls, gave alms, supported the poor, and offered gifts to churches and holy houses, in the hope that mercy would reach both the living and those who had already died. Over time, this became something more structured than private grief. It formed a whole system of remembrance, a culture of keeping names alive through liturgy, charity, and permanent religious obligations. As the early medieval centuries unfolded, these practices expanded and changed. At first, the strongest evidence comes from circles closest to power, royal households, bishops' families, and great monasteries. Yet by the Carolingian age, noble donors began to appear more frequently in records, attaching a clear request to their gifts. Prayers should be said for them and for their dead relatives. Burial choices followed the same logic. Families sought graves inside churches or within monastic precincts so that daily worship would constantly brush against their memory. Remembering the dead became part of elite devotion, not only for kings and bishops, but for the wider nobility. By the later Middle Ages, it moved beyond aristocratic society and became common in towns as well. Urban guilds, confraternities, and brotherhoods formed around shared prayer for members, creating a busy world of anniversaries, commemorations, and endowed services. This memory culture left deep traces, stone tombs and painted memorials, endowed altars and chapels, and carefully written lists of donors and benefactors meant to be read aloud year after year. Through these traces, religious life becomes visible, but so do social hierarchies, local economies, and political relationships. For the high nobility of the empire in the 12th and 13th centuries, remembrance was not a minor spiritual add-on. It stood at the centre of how great families understood themselves and how they wanted to be seen. Prayer for the dead, the shaping of burial sites, and the funding of religious communities blended into something larger. Dynastic identity and noble display. Two examples show this especially well. One is a famous and long-lasting princely house that reached its peak in the 12th century and continued to matter for centuries afterward. The other is a family that rose to prominence in the 11th century, became one of the most influential forces in the central regions of the empire, and then disappeared in the mid-13th century. These two cases illustrate how remembrance, family consciousness, and political representation could merge into a single strategy of survival. The pattern begins to sharpen in the Carolingian period and becomes especially visible from the 11th century onward. Great nobles began founding religious houses specifically to carry the burden of prayer for their line. Early foundations often followed older monastic models or formed communities of canons and canonesses. In the reform-minded atmosphere of the late 11th century, some families turned towards stricter spiritual currents and supported new styles of disciplined communal life. The following century saw other reformed orders attract heavy noble support in different regions. The appeal was obvious. These communities promised a stable rhythm of prayer, and they offered a respected place to bury family members. They also produced something equally valuable for nobles, a permanent religious centre tied to the house, a place that could serve as a family's spiritual anchor. The relationship was rarely one-sided. Founders and their heirs often held protective authority over these communities, defending their rights and property and, in return, gaining influence in local affairs. In ideal situations, the bond became tight in every direction: legal, economic, and devotional. Older scholarship used a term that suggests the strength of this tie: the monastery as a kind of family institution, almost an extension of the noble household in sacred form. Inside such places, remembrance was recorded with increasing care. Earlier, medieval lists of names evolved into more elaborate books that not only preserved donors' names, but also fixed the gifts attached to those names and the specific days on which prayers were owed. These records were not dry administration. They were instruments of memory, and historians have used them to trace kin networks and political groupings, because shared commemoration often reflected shared alliances. Remembrance, however, was not limited to naming the dead and praying for them. These religious houses became centres where noble families organised themselves across generations. They accepted sons or daughters of the founding line into their communities. They sometimes placed relatives in leadership roles. They could provide scribes who wrote documents, letters, and liturgical books for the family. In that environment, the first serious attempts to arrange family history into coherent form took shape. Genealogies did not appear only because nobles suddenly developed a taste for history. They emerged because remembrance required knowledge: who belonged to the family, which generations should be included, which dead deserved prayer, and how the lineage could be presented as continuous and legitimate. This is where remembrance begins to overlap with reputation. For aristocratic society, it was not enough to be prayed for, it was also necessary to be remembered as worthy. Memory and fame became paired concerns. If a family could highlight an ancient origin, royal connections, and glorious ancestors, it strengthened its claim to rank in the present. Over time, genealogical lists grew into narratives that praised founding figures, celebrated achievements, and framed the house as old, honourable, and destined to lead. A distinct kind of noble historical writing developed from this: works that blended monastic history with family history so closely that the two became nearly inseparable. These texts often presented a monastery story as proof of a dynasty's legitimacy, while presenting the dynasty's greatness as proof of the monastery's importance. Yet the relationship between noble families and monastic writers was not always simple. Sometimes such historical writing served the monastery more than the family. A religious house facing conflict over property, rights, or declining support could revive the memory of an illustrious founder to strengthen its own position. By telling a story of noble origins and ancient privileges, a monastery could defend its claims and pressure a family to renew obligations that had weakened. In harsher legal conflicts, fabricated foundation stories and invented documents could even appear. There were also cases where remembrance of founders grew stronger long after the founding line had vanished, because the institution itself needed a stable tradition. In such situations, memorial monuments and carefully shaped founder images were less about dynastic self-promotion and more about how a cathedral chapter or monastery understood its own identity centuries later. That is why broad theories about noble self-representation cannot be applied mechanically. Each case has to be examined closely, because the driving motive might belong to the family, the monastery, or a shifting balance between the two. Against that background, one of the best-known dynastic examples comes into focus: a house whose story reaches back toward the Carolingian age, even if its earliest origins remain difficult to trace with certainty. The family's later tradition preserved the memory of an early figure whose daughters were linked by marriage to the highest levels of Frankish power. Through these marriages, the family presented itself as standing near the imperial household, not as outsiders but as partners of equal worth. From one branch, later rulers in Burgundy would claim descent and build their own political world. In the eastern regions, the family appeared in positions of power across Swabia, Bavaria, and the Alpine territories. Around the year 1000, a decisive step was taken that many high noble families would imitate in different forms. A religious foundation was established that became a burial place and a centre of remembrance, and a nearby fortress helped form a visible heart of territorial influence. The monastery and the castle together shaped how the family was perceived. In local usage, relatives could be identified not by a dynasty name, but by association with these places, as if geography itself expressed lineage. Only later did a single dynastic label become dominant, and writers even experimented with learned language to connect the family to prestigious Roman ancestry, turning a medieval house into heirs of classical nobility by implication. In the 11th century, the family rose into the highest political tier of the empire through ducal appointments and high offices. In the following generations, its rulers held key duchies for long stretches and even combined two major regions under one powerful figure. These successes created tensions with the crown and rival dynasties, and later conflicts ended with a spectacular fall from power. Territories and titles shifted to other houses, and some family lands passed away through inheritance decisions that favoured rival relatives. At that moment, the continuity of the dynasty looked uncertain. Yet the family did not vanish. A core of inherited lands survived, especially in the north, and the line rebuilt its position there. A new ducal title was eventually created around these surviving holdings, turning private lands into the basis of renewed princely authority. From that point onward, the dynasty's later medieval history became anchored in northern concerns rather than in its earlier southern base. Modern research has emphasized that the family's story is not one single, unchanging tradition. Memory inside the dynasty shifted with political events. Different branches emphasized different origins. What the family chose to remember and how it framed that memory could change when power was gained, lost, or refounded. The earliest major family genealogy tied to this house appears in the early 12th century, produced within its own monastic centre under a ruling duke. It represents an early attempt to gather ancestors into a coherent line and to give the family a stable sense of continuity. Interestingly, the text seems to show how quickly knowledge could fade. Certain early connections were weak or missing, and whole branches that later writers emphasized were absent. The genealogy's creation likely followed a moment of renewed interest in family graves and sacred memory, as if political ambition and spiritual duty combined to push the family to look backward and organize its past. The Duke's personal bond with the monastery was so strong that he retired there and chose it as his burial place, closing an era in which this monastic centre served as the main family necropolis. Soon afterward, another genealogical tradition emerged in the north, developed in a different monastic environment with different political priorities. This northern version leaned heavily into a Saxon identity and presented the dynasty as the rightful heir to an older ducal tradition in the region. It also looked farther back into the Carolingian world and brought an early founding ancestor into clearer focus, emphasizing imperial marriage ties as proof of ancient status. In that northern narrative, the dynasty was not simply close to rulers, it was portrayed as noble enough to stand beside them as equals. By the later 12th century, one particular narrative about a great northern dynasty began to circulate in a fuller, more ambitious form. A new family history appeared around the orbit of a powerful duke from the southern branch of the house, a man who stood between two towering figures of his age, a a celebrated nephew who ruled as a major duke, and an emperor who increasingly dominated imperial politics. This text became one of the earliest extended aristocratic family stories in the German lands, and it offered something earlier accounts did not: an attempt to shape the dynasty's past into a single continuous drama, complete with origin myths, internal turning points, and a carefully staged relationship with royal power. What is striking is how strongly the writer insists on investigation and reconstruction, as if the family's beginnings had to be recovered from fragments. Instead of simply repeating older lists of ancestors, the narrative claims to be the result of real searching. It also introduces a grander ancestry than earlier traditions had dared to offer. Alongside a remembered founder from the Carolingian world, the text pushes further back into legend, attaching the family to a heroic Trojan starting point. Such claims were not meant as literal history in a modern sense. They functioned as noble language, an assertion that this was not merely an old family, but one that belonged in the same imaginative universe as the greatest lineages of Europe. The same narrative also reshapes a sensitive inheritance moment in a way that reveals how memory could serve politics. A duke who died without direct heirs is said to have intended a dramatic gift. All his holdings would pass to the family monastery, turning the religious house into the main heir. But in this version of the story, the plan is reversed after his death. His mother, portrayed as decisive and commanding, summons a grandson from Italy and transfers the inheritance to him instead, pulling the dynasty back from a dead end. The writer does not treat this as scandal. It is framed as a necessary correction because the continuation of secular lordship is presented as the greater good. Earlier family records are silent on this episode, which makes the account all the more revealing. It shows the later author's willingness to rework the past into a lesson about survival. The monastery's loss is explained away as the price of keeping the family alive. Across the narrative, the dynasty's rise is told as a constant negotiation with the crown. Loyalty appears, but so does distance, and at times, open resistance. The family is not depicted as permanently rebellious or permanently obedient. Instead, it is shown moving across the entire range of possibilities, close to kings when advantage required it, wary when independence was threatened, confrontational when honour or position seemed at stake. This approach creates a vivid pattern. The dynasty's greatness is measured not only by what it owns, but by how it stands in relation to royal authority. The underlying message is that high rank allows a family to bargain with kings, rather than simply serve them. The final sections of the text narrow toward the duke, whose circle produced the narrative in the first place. The spotlight rests on his household, his region, and his hopes for succession. His son, presented as the promise of continuity, dies suddenly during a major military campaign in Italy, swept away in the same wave of illness that struck down many soldiers. After that loss, the family's future appears to hang in the balance. The way the text treats the relationship between the southern duke and his famous northern nephew hints at a contested question. Who was meant to inherit the whole tradition, not just scattered lands? Depending on how the narrative is read, it seems designed for a moment when the northern nephew could still be imagined as the dynasty's next unifying figure, before the southern duke ultimately decided to pass his inheritance to the emperor instead. A short continuation produced in the same religious environment that had become the duke's spiritual anchor, later recorded the final arrangement and ended with the duke's burial there, closing the southern branch's story in a monastery that had been shaped by his patronage. The making of dynastic memory did not stop with writing. It also took visual form, and the images are often as revealing as the texts. In one of the most remarkable examples, an illustrated family tree appears at the end of a monastic memorial book connected to the dynasty. This is not a casual sketch. It is a deliberate display of generational succession, arranged along a single trunk with branches and leaves, carrying the line from the early founder down to the late 12th century figures. The artist's choices matter. The tree is designed to culminate not with a purely dynastic heir, but with the emperor who had been accepted as successor. That decision signals a shift in viewpoint. It suggests that, in this setting, the dynasty's story could be allowed to flow into an imperial narrative without treating the emperor as an enemy. The family's past becomes something that can be inherited by a ruler outside the bloodline, so long as the inheritance is presented as legitimate and honourable. Another image from the same monastic world reinforces this tone even more clearly. The emperor is shown enthroned between his sons, a scene that communicates continuity and legitimacy. Placing such an image at the head of a manuscript tied to the dynasty's memory is not accidental. It tells the viewer that imperial authority has been woven into the dynasty's commemorative tradition. The old monastery that had once been the family's spiritual centre is also presented as a place where the emperor can be honoured as part of the dynasty's historical outcome. Yet memory looked different in the dynasty's northern heartland. In the great church associated with the northern branch, the rulers of that line established their own burial focus. The decision to bury the ducal couple there, followed by the construction of a grand tomb, turned the institution into a stage for a specifically Saxon-centred remembrance. A genealogical chart produced around that environment begins the story not with the dynasty's Carolingian founder, but with an older Saxon ducal house. It builds forward from that starting point, showing how inheritance lines split and then converge until the dynasty is presented as the ultimate heir of a reunited Saxon tradition. The logic is unmistakable. The northern branch is not merely a continuation of an old family, it is the rightful successor of Saxon ducal authority itself. Through marriage links, buried ancestors, and carefully chosen beginnings, the dynasty is recast as the legitimate owner of a regional legacy. The most famous artistic witness to this dynastic self-image comes in the form of a lavish gospel book commissioned by the Northern Duke and his wife. 2 full-page illuminations turn the manuscript into something beyond a liturgical object. In the first, the ducal pair is presented as pious patrons, guided by saints toward the Virgin and Child. The scene is carefully staged to display devotion, protection, and legitimacy all at once. In the second illumination, the message becomes more complex. The couple kneels at the centre while crowns descend from above, and the figures of their parents and grandparents stand behind them like a living genealogy arranged into a visual argument. On one side appear royal ancestors from England, on the other side imperial ancestors from within the empire's political world. Saints frame the upper register, and Christ stands at the centre, offering an invitation to follow him by taking up the cross. The meaning of this image can be read in more than one way. It can look like a statement of rank, a claim that the ducal couple stands close to kingship and imperial dignity. It can also be read as a devotional program shaped for an altar context, emphasizing the cross, the promise of reward, and the crowns as signs of salvation rather than earthly ambition. Either way, the lower half of the image carries a clear dynastic message. The couple's identity is constructed through multiple lines of descent, reaching into the highest levels of European power. The dynasty's remembrance is not confined to one region. It is placed into a broader aristocratic world that stretches across borders and royal courts. Taken together, These writings and images show how unstable and adaptable noble memory could be. The dynasty's main memorial centres, its southern monastery, its northern monastic setting, and its ducal church, did not simply preserve a single unified tradition. Each institution had its own interests, its own patrons, and its own way of telling the story. One setting could integrate an emperor as rightful heir, another could emphasize Saxon inheritance and regional legitimacy. Even within the same family, memory could shift with political breaks. Losses of territory, changes in alliance, exile, and refoundation. Rather than one fixed dynastic narrative, there were multiple perspectives, changing over time and competing quietly with each other. A comparison with a second major dynasty, one that rose faster and disappeared sooner, makes this even clearer. This family first becomes visible in the 11th century, building power on newly developed lands at the edge of a forested region in central Germany. Within a few generations, it had transformed that base into a serious territorial presence. The rise was supported by a combination of tools: careful marriages, the construction of castles that served as administrative and symbolic centres, and the creation of a monastic foundation tied to reform ideals. The monastery became the dynasty's principal memorial home, while the castles signalled a new kind of territorial confidence. As the family expanded, it absorbed inheritances from neighbouring country houses and pushed its influence outward toward major towns and strategic river routes. Royal favour followed. A landgravial title elevated the family into a higher political tier, and later alliances brought additional offices and opportunities. For a time, the dynasty benefited from imperial politics, gaining from the collapse of rivals and the shifting balance among major princes. But in the mid-13th century, a dramatic reversal occurred. The last ruler of the line broke with the emperor, accepted support from the papacy, and allowed himself to be raised as a rival king. The move created momentary momentum, but death arrived too soon and without an heir. With that, the dynasty's lands were divided among competing claimants, and the family's political story ended as abruptly as it had risen. The dynasty's memory, however, did not vanish immediately. Its monastic centre preserved a foundation story that blended the monastery's origins with genealogical claims about the family's past. The narrative praises the house as if it had ancient imperial blood and emphasises closeness to royal authority, while downplaying inconvenient episodes of conflict or opposition. This selective shaping of the past reveals a familiar pattern. Religious institutions framed dynastic ascent in a way that made it look orderly, legitimate, and divinely favoured. Even then, it was not inevitable that this monastery would become the family's exclusive memorial home. Early connections tied the family to older regions and older churches, and burial choices could have pulled remembrance in different directions. Some relatives were buried elsewhere, and alternative memorial centres existed. Yet over time, the dynasty deliberately tightened the focus. Properties and churches linked to side branches were drawn under the monastery's orbit, and obligations were created so that prayers would be offered for all members of the family, wherever they lay. Eventually, the monastery became the primary resting place for the line. Burial near an important altar in the monastic church set a pattern that later generations followed. A sequence of tombs, gifts, and commemorations made the place into the dynasty's spiritual archive. Memory in medieval noble society did not sit in a single building, tied forever to one altar. Even when a dynasty had a famous monastery that later generations treated as the spiritual home of the family, the reality on the ground was usually wider and more fluid. The Ludowings are a good example of that. Their monastery at Reinhardsbrunn became the best-known focus for burials and prayers. But the family's remembrance culture spread across a network of churches and clerical communities that mattered for different reasons: personal careers, regional influence, and the practical need to secure prayers in more than one place. One key figure shows how this worked. A prominent cleric from the family, active in the middle of the 12th century, directed significant gifts toward another religious house beyond Reinhardsbrunn. These donations were not vague acts of generosity. They were carefully shaped as a program of remembrance, aimed at keeping the dead present on an annual cycle. The arrangements linked prayer services with concrete acts of charity: night vigils, masses, feeding the poor, and payments to the clergy who carried the duty. In other words, memory was not only spiritual language, it was an organised schedule with costs, obligations, and people assigned to carry it out year after year. The same pattern appears in the way the family's names entered cathedral remembrance lists and anniversary calendars. Those entries did not appear by accident. They were often the result of deliberate choices by individual family members who held office in the church and had the influence to anchor their relatives into a cathedral's routine of prayer. Another Landgrave later supported a major clerical community in the same region and entered into a formal bond of shared prayer with them. These steps helped create the sense that one city could stand beside Reinhardsbrunn as an additional node of commemoration. The family's dead were remembered in more than one choir, and that mattered because it multiplied security. If one institution weakened, another could still carry the name. At the same time, Reinhardsbrunn itself was never simply a private chapel reserved for a ruling house. Once a monastery rose in status and resources, other noble families noticed. They saw a powerful place that could protect burials, preserve names, and provide spiritual prestige. Reinhardsbrunn attracted outsiders early. A Thuringian count became one of the first examples. He gave property to the monastery, entered the community, and died there. He was followed by others. Over decades, a stream of donors from the region attached their own memorial needs to the Ludewig Foundation. The monastery accumulated not only gifts, but responsibilities for the dead of multiple lineages. By around 1200, it was supporting a small constellation of dependent houses and priories, and its prayer obligations expanded far beyond the original founders. Reinhardsbrunn also benefited from the Ludewig's political rise. As the family climbed into the top tier of princes, the monastery's self-image changed with it. Monastic writers began to set local events into the wider story of the empire, weaving the Landgrave's fortunes into broader imperial history. In those narratives, the dynasty's success was not treated as background detail. It became a central theme, almost a proof of the monastery's importance and the founder's special standing. Yet traditions can shift quickly when rulers change their preferences. A turning point came when a leading Landgrave chose a different burial place, not at Reinhardsbrunn, but in a newer religious setting supported by the same ruler and his household. That decision signaled a new centre of gravity. It did not erase Reinhardsbrunn's role, but it did weaken the idea that the old monastery alone defined the family's memory. This shift becomes especially visible through luxury devotional books, created for the Landgrave's court. Two richly illustrated psalters, made in a style associated with elite taste, show how remembrance and self-presentation could merge inside the private world of princely prayer. These manuscripts were not public monuments in a town square. They were intimate objects shaped for courtly devotion. And yet, their imagery speaks loudly. A dedication scene shows the princely couple kneeling in humility before the divine, offering a model of a church as a symbolic gift. The gesture functions as a visual contract. piety, patronage, and dynastic remembrance bound together in one image. In the other manuscript, the couple appears in a broader gallery of high-status marriages, aligned visually with royal families beyond their own realm. The message is subtle but unmistakable. The dynasty's standing is being framed in a royal neighbourhood. The court's literature, its ambitious building projects, its patronage of artists and scribes, and the taste embodied in these books, all reveal a political culture eager to display refinement and rank. Even when the objects were intended for private use, they still expressed identity and ambition. The next generation opened the door to even more variety. New religious movements swept across Europe in the early 13th century, and they touched princely courts as well. Reform preaching, the ideals of poverty, new forms of urban devotion, crusading enthusiasm, and the rising prestige of military religious orders offered fresh ways to express faith and status at the same time. One landgrave combined a strong attachment to the dynasty's older monastery with a broader religious horizon and generous support for new groups. He still treated Reinhardsbrunn as a key place for burial and gifts, even while living in a changing spiritual world. His brothers reveal how quickly dynastic memory could diversify. One pursued a path within a powerful military order, eventually rising to its leadership and channeling resources toward a new spiritual center tied to the cult of a recently canonized saint within the family's orbit. He chose burial not at Reinhardsbrunn, but at the saint's church, binding his own memory to a rapidly expanding pilgrimage world. Another brother favoured new mendicant movements, created a wide prayer association among clergy within his lands, and chose a different burial site again. In a single generation, the dynasty's memorial map spread outward. Multiple churches, multiple orders, multiple strategies for piety and representation. One might expect the family and its old monastery to have capitalized fully on the international fame of their canonized Landgravine. In practice, that did not happen in a lasting way. The major pilgrimage stream flowed toward the saint's tomb in another city, and the older centers struggled to benefit from it. There was even an attempt to build a local cult around the Landgrave buried at Reinhardsbrunn, when stories of healings emerged at his grave. The effort did not develop into a rival pilgrimage tradition at the time. Still, the episode shows how monasteries could respond creatively when their status was threatened. Sanctity could be a lifeline as well as a spiritual claim. After the dynasty ended, Reinhardsbrunn's bond with the founders did not simply fade. The monastery suffered severe destruction in a fire late in the 13th century, and later faced deep financial trouble. In that context, renewed interest in the buried Landgrave became more than devotion. It became part of recovery. A new text, crafted in the monastery, presented the Landgrave as a holy figure closely connected to his sainted wife, and it placed the monastery itself at the heart of his veneration. Reports of miraculous cures at the tomb did double work. They argued for the Landgrave's sanctity, and they elevated the monastery as a sacred site worth visiting. Around the same time, lavish grave monuments for leading members of the founding house appeared, strengthening the physical landscape of memory inside the church. Exactly how much of this was driven by the monastery itself, and how much by the new political lords of the region, is not always clear. What is clear is the pattern. Long after a founding family disappears, an institution can continue to shape, revive, and even reinvent the founder's memory for its own survival and prestige. Stepping back from these details, a broader conclusion emerges. Genealogies and family histories often grew out of liturgical remembrance and monastic record-keeping, and they helped create a lasting sense of lineage across generations. But the impulse behind these works did not always come from the ruling family. Sometimes a monastery wrote because it needed to defend its rights, reinforce its status, or renew a fading relationship with patrons. In one case, a great dynasty's ruler clearly drove the inquiry into origins and tradition. In another, a monastery appears to have been the main engine behind the family's origin story and historical framing. The label house monastery can be misleading because it suggests exclusivity and stable ownership of memory. In reality, families spread their gifts and burial plans across multiple institutions, while monasteries fought to keep or reclaim privileged status. Memory and identity could align, but they could also collide. The same period that produced these carefully managed cultures of prayer and memorial art was also marked by endemic violence. Conflict was not a rare emergency in the medieval empire. It was a routine condition. Noble life revolved around rivalry, honour, contested claims, and the constant need to defend reputation and rights. In that environment, the feud was not an abnormal breakdown of order. It was a recognised mechanism within the political system, and peace was not the absence of conflict so much as the negotiated outcome that allowed society to move forward after violence. Over the centuries, from the early Middle Ages into the 14th century, feuding changed in important ways. Earlier forms of conflict could operate with broad social acceptance and minimal formal structure. Over time, rulers attempted to channel violence through general peace measures, trying to limit the damage while acknowledging that conflict could not simply be wished away. Land peace decrees sought to define boundaries: who could fight, how, when, and under what conditions. This did not eliminate violence. It changed its grammar. It pushed it toward regulation, procedure, and a clearer relationship to law. Any definition of feuding that ignores these long changes will be either too narrow or too blunt. At its core, a feud was sustained hostility between parties living inside the same political world. Hostility that expressed itself through controlled acts of force. This basic reality did not disappear later. Enmity remained central. What did not happen in the medieval empire was a sweeping moral delegitimization of feuding by kings. Unlike in some other European settings, rulers did not fully succeed in branding feud as inherently unlawful. Even very late, long after attempts to impose peace norms, feuding could still be treated as part of the accepted order of self-help. That fact is essential. The feud was not merely violence outside the law, but violence that often claimed legitimacy. The sources talk about feuding in sharply different tones. Many chroniclers, especially those writing from inside religious institutions, highlighted noble aggression and presented their own communities as victims. They often described burning, plunder, and disorder without exploring the grievances that triggered the conflict. In such narratives, violence becomes a moral spectacle and a lament over disorder. Yet other narratives could treat feuds as ordinary political life, and sometimes even as justified action. Legal and normative texts tend to be pragmatic rather than philosophical. They do not always condemn feud as such, but try to restrict it, suspend it in certain periods, or impose conditions that reduce harm. A deeper layer sits beneath these genres: the culture of honour. Honour was not a decorative idea. It was competitive, easily wounded, and closely connected to public standing. In a world where authority depended on reputation as much as on documents, honour could trigger conflict and make compromise difficult. Feuds did not begin only because of greed or calculated expansion. They could also start because a party believed its standing had been damaged and demanded visible satisfaction. Modern historians have wrestled with how to interpret feuding. One approach looks at conflict mainly as a problem to be solved on the road towards stronger public peace. From that perspective, feuding appears as an obstacle to state formation, and peacekeeping becomes the hallmark of legitimate rule. Another approach emphasizes feud as a regulated form of self-help, embedded in social norms, with its own expectations of conduct. In that view, feuding is not simply the strong crushing the weak. It is a recognized method of asserting claims when other mechanisms fail or when parties refuse to accept an outcome. More recent work often turns to the social function of feuding among the lower nobility, or to the rituals that limited conflict and allowed reconciliation. A different line of research investigates how feuds could actually assist the growth of princely power. Repeated conflict could weaken smaller lords, create opportunities for princes to intervene as arbiters, and encourage the formation of territorial authority. Peacekeeping was not only a moral duty, it was also a political tool. The ability to end conflicts, impose settlements, and enforce boundaries could become a source of supremacy. Because princely lordship is at the centre of the story, the focus falls naturally on how princes and their developing territories used feud and peace to shape power. The royal perspective matters too, because kings carried an ideological responsibility to protect law and peace, even when enforcement depended on cooperation from the princes. Some related issues remain too large to absorb into a single narrative. Theories of justified war, doctrines of resistance, vendettas among lower ranks, urban violence, and everyday interpersonal aggression. Those topics form the wider landscape, but the central thread here is the interplay between legitimate conflict and negotiated peace among the high aristocracy. One key point should always remain visible. Violence was only one option among many. Medieval politics did not operate as permanent warfare. Negotiation, mediation, bargains over rights and revenues, symbolic gestures, gifts, privileges, and ritual reconciliation worked alongside threats and raids. Feud and peace were not opposites. They were linked phases in a cycle of conflict management. Feuding made claims visible through force. Peacemaking translated those claims into a new arrangement that could be lived with, at least until the next dispute. Some historians have suggested a blunt possibility about the early Middle Ages. War often did not need a carefully stated reason. Violence could operate as a competitive economy in its own right, driven by the promise of plunder. If that picture is even partly true, then a feud becomes something more specific than ordinary raiding or battlefield opportunism, because a feud implies a recognized state of hostility between named sides. The problem is that for much of the early period, sources rarely explain motives clearly. For the 11th century especially, it can be difficult to separate feuding from other kinds of violence, because the evidence often records what happened, not why it happened. Before peace movements and land peace ordinances became common tools of rule, the rules of feuding have to be reconstructed indirectly from narrative descriptions. That begins to change when formal peace initiatives appear in the empire in the later 11th century. Two broad types developed. One emerged largely from church circles, agreements that tried to carve out protected zones of life by declaring certain people, places, and times off limits. These protections were backed by spiritual penalties. The other type came from secular authorities, general peace declarations with enforceable punishments. Both aimed at the same practical goal: limiting the damage of violence that had become routine. Because a feud was not a polite duel between equals. It often meant burned villages, devastated fields, forests cut down, robbery, hostage-taking, arson, injuries, killings, actions that, outside the framework of feuding, would be treated as among the gravest crimes. As royal authority recovered strength in the early 12th century, the church-led peace movement faded in the empire, but secular land peaces continued and multiplied. These were typically created through alliances and unions, held together by oaths and valid for a defined territory and often for a defined stretch of time. Some were regional, some claimed broader reach. The most ambitious proclamations could be presented as imperial in scope, while others were limited to a province or a cluster of lordships. The logic of these measures was selective restraint, not the abolition of violence. They outlined protected time, sometimes even naming particular days of the week when certain actions were forbidden. They identified categories of people who were to be spared: clergy and monks, women, travellers, Jews, peasants, groups framed as vulnerable and therefore not legitimate targets. They also protected places and property that mattered to communal survival and religious order: churches, cemeteries, mills, vineyards. In effect, law began to draw a line not only around persons, but around the objects and spaces most likely to be ruined by conflict. Then came lists of prohibited acts: killing, serious wounding, robbery, theft, breaking into homes, burning houses or villages. These were singled out repeatedly. Some ordinances even restricted the carrying of weapons during protected periods. As time went on, regulations sometimes went beyond the violence itself and targeted common sources of disputes, such as unlawful tolls. There were also efforts to regulate the resources that made violent action possible, including what could be used and how. Yet one point stands out. Feuding as a concept was not simply erased. Many rules were temporary, tied to the duration of the peace. Some texts still assumed that conflict would continue, and some even admitted that an enemy might be harmed under limited conditions. The system was trying to civilize conflict, not pretend it could be eliminated. Even major peace declarations of the 13th century often operated on the assumption that feuds would still happen and therefore needed boundaries. By looking at what lawmakers tried hardest to ban, it becomes possible to glimpse what feuding often looked like in practice. Attacks on property mattered as much as attacks on bodies. A man's house, fields, dependents, and economic base were treated as extensions of the person. This suggests that violence in conflicts could reach lethal levels and that larger organized raids were possible. There are even hints of bigger engagements that look like pitched battles. At the same time, feuding clearly ranged in scale. Small acts by lesser men and major campaigns by powerful players could exist under the same broad label. Over time, peace measures also began to punish those who assisted peacebreakers, tightening the net around violence. Some forms of revenge remained tolerated within limits, often regulated more by local territorial or city law than by royal proclamations. The growing ambition was to force a process, reduce the suddenness of violence, and require steps before a feud could be treated as legitimate. That process becomes clearer in the late 12th and early 13th centuries. A cooling-off period appears, meant to prevent impulsive attacks and to create space for negotiation. Later, rules pushed even further. Before a feud could be declared, an appeal to judgment or a formal complaint procedure should take place. A major shift in tone appears when lawful feuding is framed as something permitted only under pressure of necessity, after other options have been tried. In theory, the message was simple: law should come first, violence second. In practice, this ideal was hard to enforce. The empire's judicial system had structural weaknesses, and courts were rarely perceived as neutral. By the later Middle Ages, the requirement of legal first could be satisfied through arbitration or other forms of attempted redress, not necessarily a clean, impartial trial. Still, a crucial development had occurred. for a feud to be recognised as lawful, some form of judgment or legal process was expected to exist in the background. As these norms gained weight, the issuing of peace regulations expanded beyond kings. Territorial lords created their own peace edicts for their lands. Cities did the same. Alliances between lords sometimes included clauses designed to keep feuds from spilling across borders and promised mutual help to suppress violence. But alliances could also be aimed outward, functioning as defensive blocs or even offensive coalitions. In other words, peacekeeping could coexist with power politics. After the age of strong royal initiatives weakened, territorial lords and cities increasingly became the practical managers of peace, with mixed results and rarely permanent success. Against this background, feud practices evolved. Because peace rules punished certain violent acts only during protected periods, their influence on methods was limited. Church law, however, exerted pressure even outside protected times, by insisting that clergy and sacred spaces should be spared, with spiritual penalties for violations. That ideal did not always hold. Arson, though heavily condemned, remained common. In fact, later medieval feuds often relied on burning, robbery, seizure, and systematic destruction. The logic is not hard to see. A feud was often a coercive strategy aimed at forcing an opponent to yield, by draining his material capacity to resist. Interestingly, direct attacks on a person became less central than attacks on assets. Practical calculation likely played a role. Killing made reconciliation harder. Ruining property could be brutal, but it still left the door open to a settlement. The legal integration of feuding did not mean the elimination of feuding methods. It meant the creation of criteria that separated punishable violence from tolerated violence. The fight over legitimacy moved into argument. Had the cooling-off period been respected? Had notice been given? Had legal redress been sought first? If the answer could be framed as no, then even a feud could be portrayed as unlawful. This left wide room for regional variations and for local traditions. It also encouraged a later medieval habit of presenting feuds in legal language, even when older narrative sources had described them in terms of sheer power, personal dominance, revenge, hatred, irritation, and especially honour. Over time, feuding could begin to look, at least on paper, like a quasi-legal procedure. How did feuds end? Not every feud required royal intervention. Even killings among the high nobility did not guarantee the ruler's involvement. Kings intervened when it suited political interests, not because they were neutral referees. For the parties involved, calling in the king could simply be another tactic in the conflict. A ruler might punish, impose a truce, pressure one side to submit, or hand mediation to a third party. Powerful princes also increasingly intervened in the feuds of lesser nobles, acting as enforcers and brokers of peace. Most often, however, feuds ended through third-party mediation, oaths, and settlements. Compensation payments could be part of the agreement. In earlier times, negotiated submission could resolve conflicts, but later peace compacts and detailed settlement documents became more common, spelling out the contested points and prescribing remedies. These agreements, more than the feuds themselves, helped push politics toward a world where contract and written settlement gained growing authority. At this point, the obvious question returns. Why start a feud at all? The sources suggest many causes that overlap and tangle together: property disputes, jurisdiction, tolls, broken promises, contested rights. But there is another category that can easily be underestimated if modern expectations dominate the reading. Sometimes, violence was driven less by legal grievance than by competitive displays of strength. One narrative about a famous emperor presents a revealing mindset. Even in times of peace, a ruler might seek conflict in order to avoid the softness of inactivity. Struggle itself could be cast as a virtue. Another story, written much later but drawing on older material, describes a saintly prince launching an attack that appears to come without prior hostility. The target is surprised because no open enmity existed. The attackers themselves hesitate only because turning back would look shameful. After the town is taken, celebration follows, and the prince returns home safely and proudly. In that telling, the campaign resembles a test of courage, a public performance of knightly power, more than a lawsuit with swords. Whether such an expedition counts as a feud depends on how narrowly the term is used. But the larger point matters. Violence could serve social patterns of rivalry. Demonstrating capacity, testing oneself, displaying command, winning admiration, could be an end in itself. In some cases, even conquest and the creation of new power structures might be fueled less by legal claims than by this culture of competitive assertion. That helps explain why sources sometimes note blunt violence without offering justification. Once that threshold is crossed, the step from raw force to feud as a political instrument becomes smaller. These examples also warn against a single interpretive habit, treating every high medieval conflict as if it were simply early modern territorial policy in embryo. Later, medieval legal frameworks could make violence sound more justified than it was. And later, chroniclers could retrofit legal reasons onto earlier actions. But not every conflict began as a calculated plan to build a territorial state. Often, it began as an injury, an offence, experienced as an attack on standing. Honour and rank were not decorative values in this world. They were among the highest social currencies, and their defence could legitimise violence. For a long time, modern scholarship tended to explain conflicts mainly through continuous territorial strategy, attributing to kings and princes a steady programme of expansion. More recent approaches have pushed back, arguing that personal hierarchy and honour disputes were not superficial excuses, but real engines of conflict. If that is accepted, then the political structure of the empire looks less like a machine for territorial consolidation and more like a hierarchy of personal relationships, in which respect, precedence, and public standing had explosive consequences. A well-known feud in the mid-12th century illustrates how this worked. The story begins with a severe act. Dependents of a major duke are executed, and their stronghold is destroyed. One source frames the event as punishment for robbery and breach of peace, yet it also suggests unequal justice. The aggressor spares his own guilty followers while striking the duke's men. That detail matters because it transforms the act from mere enforcement into humiliation. A ruler who allows his men to be publicly destroyed without response risks losing authority among the very people who sustain his power. The conflict escalates rapidly. Allies join in, turning a dispute into a wider confrontation. A battle brings a dramatic reversal. A young noble on one side suffers defeat and loses many men, and hundreds are taken prisoner. Money secures their release, but the feud continues. Outside forces are drawn in, and the violence spreads through raids that devastate the region. Eventually, an imperial assembly forces the aggressor into submission, and he is handed over to his enemies, dying in captivity according to one account, or being exiled according to another. The accounts differ, but both show the same dynamic. The feud becomes a stage where reputation, alliances, and authority are tested. Some readings explain such a feud primarily as a struggle over territory, expansion versus containment, control of roads and tolls, seizure of strategic castles. that kind of rivalry certainly existed, but a purely territorial explanation struggles to account for the social cost of inaction. If a lord failed to avenge the execution of his own household men, especially when the justice applied to them was visibly unequal, the damage would fall on his credibility. Dependents expected protection, and loyalty was not a one-way chain. It rested on reciprocity, service in exchange for support. Defending their honour was inseparable from defending the lord's own. Violence in the medieval empire was not driven by a single motive. Honour mattered, but so did claims of right, attempts to recover what had been taken, demands for revenge, and calls to punish a wrong. Sometimes a feud began because someone chose to stand behind a friend or a relative. Sometimes it began because authorities tried to enforce peace and found that punishment itself triggered further conflict. The same outward action could carry different meanings depending on who described it. Self-help, justice, retaliation, or the defense of order. Among the most persistent flashpoints was inheritance. Noble families were built on property, office, and legal titles that rarely formed a clean, unified package. When a major figure died, conflict could erupt not only between close relatives, but also between claimants whose rights were based on different kinds of law. A distant male line cousin might claim one set of holdings through lineage, while a daughter or sister might press a claim through marriage and blood. A ruler might confirm one party's claim to the fiefs attached to an office, while another party fought for the allodial lands and local rights that were not held from the crown at all. A crisis in the mid-13th century shows how quickly this could become a multi-sided struggle. After the death of a powerful landgrave without heirs, a distant agnatic relative asserted a claim, backed by imperial authority, for the fiefs that had belonged to the office. At the same time, a woman from the ruling family, married into another dynasty, fought to secure a future for her son. Her focus lay especially in a secondary region, where the dynasty held extensive lands and rights, many of them rooted in private holdings and church relationships, rather than in imperial investiture. Such a division of objectives may even reflect arrangements made by the last ruler before his death, agreements that have not survived, but may have shaped how each side calculated its chances. The conflict did not stay between two parties. A great church lord asserted his own rights over a key county as a church fief, complicating the contest further. Three powers ended up confronting each other through shifting alliances, partial deals, and repeated settlements. Step by step, agreements narrowed the conflict until a final arrangement emerged. One claimant established himself in one core region. Another secured the contested secondary region, but only by accepting a vassal relationship to the church that claimed superior rights. This outcome underlines a basic medieval reality. Inheritance disputes rarely ended with a clean victory that swept all claims aside. More often, they ended through compromises that rearranged relationships, redefined tenure, and created new layers of dependency. Inheritance was not the only spark. Castle building could be just as explosive. A new fortress changed the balance of power on the ground. It could block roads, dominate markets, threaten neighbours, and turn a legal disagreement into a practical emergency. In the same way, conflicts over advocacy rights repeatedly set nobles against religious institutions. Church communities expected protection and respect for their property, while lay protectors insisted on rights of oversight, income, and authority. Each side could claim law and tradition. Each side could interpret the same custom in opposite directions. Monastic complaints about violent protectors are full of vivid accusations, but they also reveal how entangled the relationship had become. Some archbishops fought long struggles against regional nobles over the building and occupation of castles, precisely because these were not isolated private quarrels. They were contests over who could control space, revenue, and enforcement. Conflict also rose from below, not only from the top. Those who lived under lordship could resist it. Sometimes resistance looked like refusal, withholding dues, refusing service, evading obligations. Sometimes it took on more aggressive forms, raiding, feuding, driving out officials, even attacking the lord himself. Lords tended to describe such acts as rebellion and conspiracy, while participants could understand them as defense against injustice. In towns, resistance often aimed at changing how the city was governed and who held power inside it. In rural regions, communal organization could sustain a long challenge to a lord's authority. A striking example is a peasant community that resisted both a regional count and an archbishop for decades. The conflict was not a brief riot, it developed over time, supported by local structures, until it was crushed by a coalition of knights drawn from the church territory and neighbouring counts. Even after victory, rule did not simply revert to the pre-conflict situation. The region's lordship was divided between the victorious powers. That result hints at a recurring theme. Violence could destroy, but its settlement could also reorder politics. In medieval thinking, vengeance and punishment were closely intertwined. The language used to describe retaliation often framed it as the restoration of justice rather than uncontrolled rage. Vengeance could be presented as something that followed legal procedure, and when the target was portrayed as an enemy of the church, even warfare could be justified as corrective force. This mindset mattered because it gave a moral and legal vocabulary to acts that might otherwise look like private revenge. One long feud that followed the murder of a leading archbishop shows how conflicts could grow like branches from a single trunk. The killing itself happened during an argument over control and protection of a religious institution. The murderer was captured and executed. His property was seized, not only as punishment but as a political act. The story could have ended there. Instead, it widened. The murderer's sons, supported by their mother's relatives, launched a struggle to recover what had been confiscated. Their fight was directed not only against the archbishopric, but also against another count who benefited from the redistribution of the lands. Allies joined on both sides, driven partly by family loyalty and partly by their own disputes. One duke sided against the archbishop for reasons tied to a separate conflict over rights and obligations. The feud became a bundle of inheritance claims, jurisdictional arguments, and competing visions of justice, each side insisting that law was on its side. This is where third-party support becomes central. A man did not always feud only for himself. Feuds could be fought for a friend or a kinsman, or because ties of service demanded it. Friendship in the medieval sense carried expectations of backing, even if it was not always an absolute duty. Kinship did the same, but some relationships created stronger obligations. Vassals and servants could be expected to join their lord's quarrel. In that world, neutrality could be interpreted as disloyalty, and refusing help could be remembered as an injury. Violence could also be justified as the defense of peace. Peace regulations were not self-enforcing. They required sanctions, and sanctions often required force. Princes had duties tied to order, and punishing a peacebreaker could trigger retaliation. When the offender was powerful or well-connected, enforcement could easily turn into a wider feud. Late medieval peace associations developed detailed clauses for how and when members should provide armed support, what limits applied, and how far action could go. Yet those same agreements could also function as alliances against outsiders. The line between collective peacekeeping and collective warfare could blur depending on circumstances. Then there is the question of expansion. Violence was not always a reaction to insult or injury. It could also be used offensively. Some historians have described powerful rulers engaging in intimidation as a deliberate style of politics. Yet broad claims about expansion can become traps if they flatten the complexity of medieval law. Many conflicts that look like naked aggression rest on legal ambiguity rather than simple lawlessness. A famous duke illustrates the problem. In one case, a county holder died without children, and the closest heir was a cleric. Competing claims emerged immediately. One party sought to transfer the inheritance to a church. Another claimed rights through marriage into the family, and the duke asserted that such counties should revert to ducal control. Reports describe intimidation and coercion during negotiations, even the arrest of a leading churchman. In another case, the same duke destroyed an existing economic centre that belonged to a bishop and built a rival settlement nearby that later grew into a major city. These actions appear violent and aggressive, and they had all the ingredients for a feud. Yet recent interpretations suggest that the duke's behaviour cannot be explained simply as criminal expansion. His understanding of ducal authority was itself part of the conflict, and the boundaries of that authority were not precisely fixed. In the empire's political order, many areas were not regulated by clear, enforceable norms. Different traditions and legal arguments could overlap and collide. Multiple claims could exist over the same object: office rights, private property, church tenure, inherited custom, royal privilege. Even with detailed sources, it can be difficult to say who crossed a line. Contemporaries often faced the same uncertainty. One party's traditional right might be another party's unacceptable overreach. And when a new interpretation of an old right was asserted with force, conflict could erupt suddenly, leaving observers to describe it as deliberate aggression. This is part of why feuds can look like instruments of expansion. In reality, many were battles over contested rights, in a system where law was plural and enforcement was uneven. Short-term alliances added further confusion, creating shifting coalitions that do not fit a clean map of territorial blocks. The weakness of centralized enforcement produced a political landscape with many centers of power, often competing openly. That dynamic did contribute to the growth of princely authority over time. But it does not automatically mean every feud began with a grand plan. Feud settlements mattered here. The integration of lesser nobles into emerging lordships often occurred through negotiated endings to conflict. Agreements reduced the ability of smaller actors to attach themselves to multiple lords at once and play patrons against each other. Over time, settlements narrowed options, fixed obligations, and made affiliations more exclusive. From a distance, this can be labelled a struggle for dominance. But in many cases, the concrete gains were modest and temporary, while the long-term pattern was shaped by repeated compromises rather than decisive conquest. That mismatch between small immediate outcomes and the idea of a constant drive for hegemony raises an uncomfortable but necessary question. How much can be assumed about intention? Some rulers clearly pursued coherent strategies of rule. Others acted opportunistically, reacting to disputes, openings, and emergencies, without a consistent territorial blueprint. This tension leads into the debate about territorialization. One common explanation for late medieval development is that lordship gradually shifted from being mainly personal and relational toward being increasingly tied to control over a defined area. Rights and possessions were concentrated. Regional centres formed. Lords sought preeminence by controlling offices, fiefs, private lands, judicial power, castles, towns, income streams, and the service networks that made enforcement possible. These resources were contested in court, through influence and through violence. In that sense, feuds often served as extra legal pressure inside legal disputes. They rarely created new law by themselves. The new relationships emerged in the settlements that ended violence. Peace enforcement, backed by force, became both a tool and a justification for lordship. Yet the language of territorial politics is controversial. It easily implies a forward-looking plan, as if medieval princes were building modern states. Many scholars argue that this is misleading. Dynastic interests, marriage, inheritance accidents, and sheer chance shaped the outer form of a principality as much as any consistent program. In that view, it is better to speak about princely lordship rather than territorial state building. This perspective reinforces a crucial point about feuds. Even when conflict contributed to the consolidation of a region over the long run, that does not prove that consolidation was the aim at the start. Outcomes should not be mistaken for intentions. The medieval empire that dominated the map of Central Europe was never a simple, neatly bounded state. It was vast, unevenly developed, and constantly changing shape. Its borders shifted with every generation. Its internal balance changed with every election, every dynastic break, every political bargain. It did not grow from a single heartland outward in a straight line. It was built like a web, with several powerful hubs pulling in different directions, sometimes cooperating, sometimes competing, always reshaping the whole. By the 11th century, this realm rested on a personal union of major kingdoms. A single ruler could claim authority across regions north and south of the Alps, and in lands that stretched toward the west as well. Yet that authority was not exercised in the same way everywhere. The strongest grip usually lay in the northern kingdom, where the ruler was chosen and acknowledged most directly. Beyond the Alps, imperial influence could expand dramatically when a ruler invested time, wealth, and force into presence there. But it could also fade, even while the claim itself remained. This created a recurring pattern. Impressive reach in theory, uneven control in practice. Titles and political language added another layer of complexity. Rulers did not present themselves as heads of a single, national kingdom in the modern sense. Their identity and legitimacy were shaped by older traditions of Roman authority, and by the expectation that royal power could lead toward imperial power. For centuries, a ruler who had not yet received the highest coronation still adopted titles that signalled an intended role beyond one region. The German label that later seems obvious was slow to become official, and even then it never fully captured the multi-regional character of the empire's claims and traditions. Inside the northern heartlands, certain great duchies and regions played an outsized role in politics. Elsewhere, other zones rose in importance over time. Some as borderlands turned into strongholds, others as counties and marches transformed into principalities. New powers emerged through settlement and clearance, especially eastward expansion driven not by the ruler alone, but by ambitious regional lords. Even when the royal court spoke the language of universal authority, the work of building new realities on the ground was often carried by local princes with their own interests and agendas. At a certain point, the gap between what rulers imagined and what subjects experienced widened. Grand horizons collided with regional life. A ruler could pursue influence in distant lands and still struggle to enforce decisions in nearer territories. The more the empire's reach spread, the more varied its internal worlds became. Large regions developed distinct identities based on language, custom, trade routes, social networks, and shared memory. Each of these regions played its own political games and followed its own logic. This is why the empire could be described as a single realm and yet behave like many realms at once. Over time, the outer edges began to drift away from the center of gravity. In some peripheral zones, imperial rights were claimed but rarely enforced. In others, influence weakened steadily, until detachment became a fact of life. Certain frontier areas and confederations learned that refusing burdens carried little immediate cost. The empire might speak as a whole, but its ability to compel cooperation was uneven, and that unevenness shaped the long-term story. Royal effectiveness depended heavily on the moving court. Power travelled with people, not with fixed institutions. The ruler's household, entourage, and political theatre were the main instruments of government. Because of this, royal influence rose and fell with presence. When the court arrived, decisions could be made, disputes could be judged, rewards could be distributed, alliances could be renewed. When the court moved on, local forces regained space. Coherence was real, but fragile. It was never reinforced by a strong administrative skeleton across the whole realm. This weakness existed early, but it became sharper after major dynastic breaks and long periods without stable leadership. Politics in this empire worked less like a command chain and more like a bargain system. The ruler stood at the top, but the upper nobility was not simply ruled. Great lords were partners in selection and recognition. They confirmed a new king through election and homage, then expected attention, protection of their interests, and participation in decisions. A newly chosen ruler also faced a practical challenge: uniting personal supporters from his earlier life with the traditional networks attached to the crown. Every reign reset the pattern of influence. Continuity depended not on permanent institutions, but on relationships, trust, and negotiated expectations. That is why older ideas of a single central power controlling obedient subjects no longer fit this medieval world. The relationship between ruler and realm moved between what was demanded and what was delivered. If requests went unanswered, those disappointed did not simply vanish. They often gravitated toward regional courts, which became alternative centers of opportunity. Dynastic marriages, personal alliances, and cross-regional networks could also hold the empire together without the ruler being the only binding force. In this system, the empire's unity was a product of many ties, not a single mechanism. For centuries, the court remained mobile. The ruler's journeying household served as the highest stage of political life, but it was not a capital in the modern sense. The empire had no single city that shaped the whole by default. Multiple centers existed, and their importance shifted with each dynasty. Even when the moving court sat at the top, it never erased the reality that this realm was polycentric by nature. Earlier, rulers had concentrated their movement within core zones, where their own resources and traditions were strongest. Later, kings travelled more deliberately across wider areas because personal presence was the price of authority. In a world with limited written administration and weak routine communication, participation in rulership meant accompanying the king, seeing him, negotiating with him, and standing near him. Yet even this had limits. Kings relied on core regions equipped with royal estates, not on fixed capitals. If a core zone weakened, royal influence in whole swaths of the realm could suffer for generations. A powerful dynasty in the 12th century came close to achieving unusually broad coverage of the empire's major regions. Its rulers travelled from northern ports to southern cities and made repeated campaigns beyond the Alps. They built and used palaces, relied on their own estates, and developed new bases of support. They tried to strengthen direct royal lands across multiple regions, creating a firmer platform than earlier rulers had possessed. Still, even at this high point, certain corners remained empty spaces from the court's viewpoint, and whenever the ruler concentrated on distant theatres, especially across the Alps, the northern peripheries could feel more distant, not less. Presence in one place could produce absence elsewhere, and absence created openings for local consolidation. The strain became sharper when the political system split and rival claimants fought over the throne. With two kings competing, the map of influence fractured. One ruler might be strong in the southwest, another in the Lower Rhine. Meanwhile, the broader political community had to navigate conflicting loyalties, overlapping claims, and shifting alliances. Even when stability returned, it could be undercut by a different problem: absentee rule. When an emperor governed mainly from far away, the practical outcome was predictable. Princes expanded their own authority. Their lordships hardened into more closed territorial structures. Royal intervention became difficult, slow, and costly. After the collapse of a great dynasty, the empire entered a long period in which continuity at the top became the exception rather than the rule. In societies built on personal leadership and patrimonial power, long reigns mattered. They stabilized networks and expectations. Frequent dynastic change did the opposite. In this empire, elective kingship prevented the throne from becoming reliably hereditary, and that made the continuity problem worse. In a relatively short late medieval period, many kings came from many different families. The electors often rotated choices deliberately to prevent any one house from entrenching itself. The result was a system that institutionalized dynastic change. As rulers changed, the center of the empire shifted. There was no single capital and no single burial place for kings that could anchor a permanent political heart. Instead, a set of important locations served different functions, some for elections, some for assemblies, some for symbolic ceremonies. These places were not always the dynastic heartlands of the ruling family, and they did not form a compact zone. The empire did not so much lack a capital as possess several different ones, none of which truly unified the whole. Royal power in this period often narrowed to two basic capacities: the ability to legitimize and the ability to sanction. The ruling apparatus was modest relative to the empire's size. At the same time, royal authority had to compete with a dozen powerful regional systems. Out of this competition emerged new horizontal connections, alliances and networks between princes and cities that crossed borders and did not always depend on the king's direct leadership. These cross-regional ties eventually helped strengthen coherence. But at first, they also reflected the reality that the empire was not simply a vertical structure of obedience. To make sense of the later medieval empire, it helps to think in zones of proximity and access. Some areas lay in the ruler's hereditary power base, where influence could be exerted more strongly. Other regions were close to the king's roots and gatherings, making royal presence more frequent and intervention more plausible. Some territories remained open to royal influence without being fully controlled. Others belonged to the electors, whose autonomy and constitutional role made them a special category. Still, others were the lands of rival dynasties, where the crown's authority could be entangled with family competition. And beyond these lay distant regions, especially in the north and far corners, where the king's will could be felt least. This way of mapping the empire often explains political reality better than official legal labels, because it reflects how power actually moved. Certain kings tried to restore older patterns by recentering rule in zones traditionally close to the crown's heartlands. Some avoided shifting their political core to peripheral inheritances, even when they gained new lands by luck. Others pursued an aggressive dynastic strategy, expanding family possessions and turning them into the crown's true foundation. In this era, the crown's old communal resources mattered less than the elected king's own house power. That house power could be expanded through marriages, acquisitions, and enfeoffments, sometimes creating striking but fragile constructions that stretched from one edge of the empire to another. At times, a ruler succeeded in bringing a distant electoral territory into closer alignment with the empire's centre, knitting together alliances like a bridge across the map. A peripheral march could become unusually connected to the wider realm through deliberate family policy, marriage links, and political bargains. In another moment, a dynastic heartland became a major political hub, serving functions beyond anything previously seen in a medieval residence. Under such conditions, the crown could integrate north and south more effectively than usual. Traditional relationships were maintained while new ones were created. For a while, the empire's coherence benefited from this favourable geometry. But these arrangements rarely lasted. Crisis could erupt, and a central landscape could lose its value for generations. Revolutions, religious upheaval, and internal fracture could turn a once ideal hub into a contested zone, pushing the empire back into a more fragmented balance. Seen in the long view, the empire's defining feature may be its constant shifting between centres and peripheries. This permanent movement made any single region's dominance difficult to maintain. It challenged simple stories of steady progress from barbarism to civilization, or of a slow, inevitable march toward a modern nation-state. In the German lands especially, the medieval experiment was a universal empire that never fully solved the problem of organizing multinational rule into a stable structure. Over time, the German kingdom intensified into a more coherent constitutional framework, while other parts drifted away or remained distinct. Some peripheral regions separated, others stayed attached in certain ways, and some parts of the older imperial kingdoms retained partial connections. What endured most consistently was the empire's legitimizing language and its constitutional traditions. In the late 15th century, major reform laws created a broad framework that would survive for centuries. The medieval world did not hand down only strong territories. It also handed down a lasting constitutional structure that shaped the empire's final long phase. Nowhere is the danger of modern labels clearer than in the old Middle Zone, once associated with a Carolingian king's realm between river systems and cultural frontiers. In the 9th century, its borders shifted and its political fate swung between Western and Eastern kingdoms. Yet it repeatedly reappeared as a distinct structure, sometimes as an independent kingdom, sometimes as a duchy, sometimes as an identity more than an institution. By the mid-11th century, writers could describe this region as belonging to both neighbouring worlds and to neither completely, reflecting a mixed identity formed by geography and history. In later centuries, that old middle zone fragmented into many lordships. Ducal houses that retained old titles even as their practical supremacy declined. Counties that rose to prominence, and a dense patchwork of ecclesiastical territories whose bishops and abbots wielded political power. Over time, more and more distinct principalities and counties appeared, alongside city powers and a web of smaller lordships. Even certain border regions were held in dual relationships, owing allegiance in one direction while being culturally tied in another. The result was a landscape where power could not be reduced to a simple duel between a duke and a king, or a church and a noble house. Authority was shared, contested, and negotiated among many actors. This creates a problem of vocabulary. Older scholarship often used words that imply modern statehood, as if these medieval lordships were early versions of nation-states, waiting to be born. Such language is misleading. It suggests continuity where the record shows breaks, accidents, and changing structures. It also reflects later national and regional agendas that projected modern boundaries backward onto the Middle Ages. Comparative research has gradually undermined this illusion, showing how varied these lordships were and how differently they developed. Modern debates about the very idea of the state have added to this reassessment. Many historians now reject the idea that early and central medieval politics should be described as a straightforward prelude to modern state formation. Power in this era was not monopolized by a single dynasty with a unified apparatus. Functions associated with the state, such as justice, peacekeeping, and protection of the church, were carried out by many overlapping authorities. Local nobles, regional princes, religious houses and towns all participated in governance. They were not merely rivals to counts and dukes. They were often part of the governing fabric itself. To understand how territorial lordships formed and stabilized in this middle zone, attention has shifted toward difference that older narratives overlooked. Cultural factors shaped identity and cohesion, including language and the growth of written administration. Social networks connected lords and followers. Concepts of law, space, and authority framed how claims were made. Practical politics mattered too. Where rule was exercised, how it was performed, how authority moved between levels, and how control shifted through inheritance, marriage, conquest, and negotiation. The growth of territory was not only about conquering land, it was also about building administration, integrating local elites, and bringing towns into the structure of rule. The rise of medieval territorial lordships did not happen overnight. It was a slow weaving together of many different strands of authority. From the late 11th century onward, dukes and counts began to combine rights that had once existed separately. Some were private possessions inherited within families. Others were public powers originally granted by kings, such as the right to judge, to collect tolls, to mint coins, or to command men in war. There were also rights tied to churches and monasteries, especially the role of protector, which gave a secular lord influence over vast spiritual estates. Gradually, these varied elements were gathered into a single framework of rule that covered defined areas rather than scattered privileges. For a long time, historians explained this transformation as an act of emancipation. Local counts were said to have broken free from imperial control and from the authority of older, ducal deputies who once represented the crown in the Lotharingian lands. The process was often portrayed as driven by ambition, a hunger for power that pushed regional lords to seize what had belonged to the emperor. Yet other voices have emphasized a different mechanism: the growing acceptance that offices of count could pass by inheritance. Once a public office became hereditary, it was no longer simply a delegation from above, but the foundation of a family domain. By the middle of the 12th century, church institutions increasingly dealt with nearby counts, rather than with distant emperors when they sought confirmation of privileges. Around the same time, the old ducal office that had once acted as the empire's highest judicial authority in these regions faded from practical use. After the death of a powerful emperor in the late 12th century, no ruler again tried to intervene decisively as overlord in the internal affairs of the emerging principalities. Authority had effectively shifted downward and outward. A revealing moment occurred at an imperial assembly in the 1180s, when the emperor attempted to reshape the political map by elevating a count to princely rank and reorganizing several counties as a new imperial march. The project collapsed under opposition from neighboring powers and because of unexpected dynastic developments. yet it showed how fluid the hierarchy still was. Similar attempts by other counts to purchase or claim princely status also failed. Only much later, in the 14th century, did several territories finally receive ducal dignity. These promotions were less the result of a coherent imperial program than of the need to defend the western frontier against external pressures. More recent research has looked inside the territories themselves, rather than only at imperial politics. Dynastic self-representation, seen in seals, coins, charters, family chronicles, and burial monuments, reveals how local rulers imagined their own authority. The first documents that named a count after a specific castle appeared around the turn of the 12th century. Legal acts increasingly took written form produced by scribes in the count's household. The language of these charters began to speak of public authority vested in the count, not merely of private ownership. At almost the same time, the first dynastic seals emerged across the region, marking a new visual assertion of power. These changes point to two broader developments. Although the old ducal titles retained prestige, the practical difference between a duke and the strongest counts narrowed. At the same time, secular rulers borrowed methods from bishops, who for generations had pursued territorial strategies of their own, gathering judicial rights, building castles, controlling monasteries, subordinating lesser lords, and enforcing peace. Counts and dukes mixed royal grants, church advocacy, and private land so thoroughly that contemporaries could no longer easily distinguish their origins. The word count itself covered both royal deputies of earlier centuries and the dynastic rulers of the New Age. Old royal rights became tools of local consolidation. Palaces once belonging to the crown were turned into family strongholds. Lords struck coins in their own name, set tolls on rivers and roads, create markets beneath their walls. Advocacy over monasteries allowed them to penetrate ecclesiastical wealth, though reform writers often exaggerated this as simple plunder. Castles became magnets for settlement, and new towns grew at their feet. Family monasteries provided burial places, scribes, and a memory that anchored the dynasty to a particular landscape. If one follows only the map, the story might appear as a straightforward accumulation of territory. Yet power was more than land. It involved social networks, cultural symbols, and negotiated relationships. A few examples illustrate the variety. Along the Lower Rhine, a noble family styled itself after the castles of Wassenberg and later Gelders, combining inherited lands with comital and advocacy rights that reached back generations. In the west, another lineage ruled a county named after an ancient district, yet its true centre lay in a castle town that became the dynasty's heart. To the south of the Ardennes, a house gathered rights on the Moselle, in the Eifel, and in the forests, and founded a monastery near its fortress, to escape dependence on a nearby episcopal city. Farther south again, a ducal family controlled scattered zones between mountains and river valleys, its influence divided between northern and southern poles. Each territory grew from a different mixture of resources and traditions. From the mid-12th century, a first phase of consolidation can be observed. Comital charters became more numerous and more standardized. Administrative circles slowly took shape, though they remained informal and flexible. Retinues expanded to include scribes, councillors, and courts in which old nobles and former ministerial servants merged into a single knightly class. Vassalage became a key instrument of integration, binding local lords more closely to the territorial prince. Central offices appeared that were no longer hereditary, but dependent on the ruler's favour. The seneschal emerged as the chief deputy, responsible for justice, finance, and military organisation. Beneath him, provosts administered districts that often followed earlier county lines, but could also reflect newly acquired zones. These officials were drawn from nobles, ministerials, and increasingly from townsmen. The machinery of government was still light, yet it marked a step toward a more structured rule. Urban centres played a growing role. Castles that had been military outposts turned into administrative hubs and market towns. Lords granted privileges to attract settlers and secure loyalty, especially in border areas. In exchange for liberties, towns were expected to defend the territory and contribute taxes. By the 14th century, some cities overshadowed all others within a region and were described as the head of the land, even if rulers continued to reside in several places. Expansion in the late 13th and early 14th centuries became more difficult. Most major territories were already entrenched, and attempts to enlarge them often led to war. Claims based on inheritance collided, and only the extinction of a dynasty could open the way for major gains. More common was the effort to thicken control within existing borders. Lesser lords were pressured to accept their castles as fiefs, acknowledging the prince's right of access. Bonds of vassalage were increasingly defined in territorial terms, rather than purely personal ones. Even high justice, once a mark of independence, could be granted by the prince without undermining his supremacy. Money began to shape politics in new ways. Some rulers forgave dues on condition that their vassals used the saved funds to buy nearby lands, and then returned them as fiefs. Others purchased neighbouring counties outright, with borrowed capital. Financial innovation allowed a small number of dynasties to transform themselves into major powers, sometimes even winning crowns beyond their original homeland. Settlement policies accompanied these strategies. Forests were cleared and new villages founded under generous laws to secure border zones. In the coastal northwest, drainage projects reclaimed land from the sea and created rich meadows that supported the textile economy. Local boards overseeing these works were often led by comital officials, showing how economic and political authority intertwined. Administrative rationalization accelerated. General comptrollers appeared across the region from the late 13th century, supervising revenues and expenditures, sometimes with their own seals and courts. Accounting became more systematic, with registers of income, rent rolls, and audits. The earliest such books survived from different territories at slightly different moments, revealing how quickly written government spread. Credit played a decisive role. Financiers advanced large sums to princes in return for pledges of districts and offices, and some rose from urban backgrounds to the highest positions of state. A small treasury can shape a dynasty's entire strategy. In the lands around Luxembourg, limited routine income pushed rulers to hunt for revenue, where medieval power so often hid: roads, rivers, markets, and the right to protect them. Control of a major route could turn movement into money. A toll point on a busy river, an escort fee on a dangerous road, or a privileged fare that drew merchants from far away could bring in cash more reliably than scattered rural dues. That is why Luxembourg's counts repeatedly looked beyond their core territory. They tried to push into regions that offered access to the Maas and to the long corridors of trade linking the Rhineland with Brabant and Flanders, or Champagne with the cities of the Upper Rhine, and even the Great West-East line running from Paris toward Metz and Strasbourg. Every extension of influence toward these arteries promised new tolls, more traffic to tax, and stronger leverage over neighbours. Even when territorial expansion failed, the logic behind it stayed the same. If a county could not grow crops into wealth, it could grow gateways into income. Rulers also tried to create revenue without conquering new land. New toll stations appeared in places where travellers could be made to pay, and market rights were handed out to turn settlements into taxable hubs. Good order itself became a political product. A king could praise a regional prince for making routes safe, because safe routes meant more movement, and more movement meant more dues collected without constant coercion. In this world, security and profit were closely linked. Protecting a merchant caravan could be framed as public service and still function as a business model. One of the most effective tools was the fair. A well-designed annual market could pull trade away from rivals. In Luxembourg, a major commercial gathering was promoted by offering merchants something they valued more than any privilege: predictable safety. Travellers were freed from routine charges except for the cost of escort, and protection was promised not only during the fair itself, but also during the days leading up to it and after it ended, the period when merchants were most vulnerable. Peace arrangements were negotiated with neighbouring lords and towns to keep the roads open. Such diplomacy was not only about goodwill, it was infrastructure, the medieval kind, an attempt to control violence so commerce could move. Elsewhere, the same pattern appeared. Along the Rhine, escort rights and river tolls could transform a modest lord into a wealthy one. To protect a road was to claim authority over a defined space, and the fee attached to that protection advertised the claim every time a traveller paid. The right to mint money served a similar double purpose. It strengthened the economy by providing coin in circulation, and it broadcasted sovereignty by stamping a ruler's name and symbols into daily life. In Luxembourg, coin production expanded from a small number of mints to several sites, and minting rights were defended against powerful subordinates who might otherwise strike their own coin and blur the line between vassal and prince. Conflicts over coinage were not trivial, technical disputes. They were fights over who truly ruled. Other lordships found money in less respectable places. Some increased charges on Jewish and Lombard moneylenders and exchange dealers, or demanded payments for opening new exchange operations, and in darker moments enriched themselves through confiscations. Yet even the rulers who taxed these communities still depended on them. Credit was the lifeline of territorial politics. War, diplomacy, marriage alliances, castle building, and even royal ambitions could require sums far beyond ordinary income. Princes might condemn financiers in public and borrow from them in private, because necessity rarely bowed to ideology. Extraordinary taxation, especially taxes demanded for special needs, spread slowly in this region. Before the mid-14th century, it was not yet normal to impose such levies routinely with formal approval from estates. But emergencies forced change. After military disasters, rulers demanded exceptional payments to compensate knights and stabilize their position. Sometimes, this created negotiations between prince, nobles, and towns. And sometimes it sparked unrest when decisions were made without consultation. The difference mattered. Where estates were involved, extraordinary taxation could become a step toward political integration. Where they were ignored, it could become a spark for rebellion. Not all extraordinary income came from taxes. Princes extracted money through service contracts, guard agreements, and payments tied to military support. They could also gain access to outside revenue when kings pledged valuable rights as security. A single lucrative toll pledged by a monarch could outweigh the ordinary resources of a small county. These windfalls were politically explosive. They could finance new campaigns, buy land, reward followers, and sustain a ruler's ambitions far beyond what local income would normally allow. As money pressures intensified, another change followed: the gradual inclusion of different social groups into decision-making. Crises pushed territories toward assemblies that brought nobles and towns together. Succession disputes, The risk of underage heirs, heavy debts, and military defeats all had the same effect. A ruler facing uncertainty could grant consultation rights to privileged towns and independent lords, not purely out of generosity, but because survival demanded cooperation. Councils were formed that monitored administration, and written rules began to appear to define how authority would function in the ruler's absence or after his death. These arrangements helped keep territories from splitting apart when dynastic continuity was threatened. In some regions, the estates became bold enough to demand a share of government. Where a minor inherited, councils drawn from the orders took control, hired notaries, and developed procedures that made their authority durable. Elsewhere, towns leveraged their financial importance. If merchants and urban elites had funded territorial expansion, they expected influence when the count died or the regime entered crisis. Luxembourg also shows how rule depended on more than one class. A noble council could provide continuity during regencies and long absences, and powerful offices were sometimes claimed by old families. At the same time, men with urban experience and financial skill were increasingly valuable to princes. The boundary between nobles and ministerial service elites blurred. Over time, a single leading class emerged, combining hereditary prestige with administrative competence. Towns began to appear as formal witnesses in high dynastic acts, and were asked to guarantee succession arrangements. Certain good towns, recognized as pillars of the territory, were treated as partners in lordship. Eventually, towns and nobles together agreed to finance warfare through special aids. The church, however, often entered these estate structures later than other groups, and its formal role could lag behind the rising influence of lay elites. By the mid-14th century, the long process of building territorial lordship was still incomplete, and it would be misleading to describe these polities as modern states. Yet the direction is clear. Rulers and regional elites gradually replaced older face-to-face control with broader structures that linked nobles, towns, and many newer religious institutions into a shared land, held together by common peace and law. The arrangement benefited multiple sides. Princes gained resources and stability. Nobles gained protection and a predictable framework for rights. Towns gained privileges and influence, and economic life gained security. Cultural practices travelled between groups. Writing that had been cultivated in monasteries was sharpened by towns for practical administration and then adopted more widely by territorial governments. As expertise diversified inside government, lordship became more efficient, and early signs of modernization appeared. Unevenly, differently from place to place, but visible. Far to the east, another story unfolds that shows how unpredictable dynastic futures could be. The Wettins began as frontier lords, rising from the edge of the realm where danger and opportunity lived, side by side. Their later greatness, electoral rank, European marriages, mining wealth, and a powerful role in imperial politics, could not have been foreseen in their earliest phase. Yet one striking feature runs through their long history. Their power remained deeply tied to the region where their rise began. Their dynasty grew, but their core stayed rooted. Their origins were debated even in the Middle Ages. Later generations constructed grand ancestries, tying the family to heroic figures and ancient opponents of Charlemagne. Not because evidence demanded it, but because prestige required it. Modern scholarship stripped away much of this legend building and looked instead to offices and land. Attention turned to the moment when a Wettin figure received the Meissen March, and anniversaries were celebrated as if a single appointment could explain centuries of change. Behind these shifting stories lies a familiar truth. Dynasties tend to explain themselves in ways that match their current status. What can be said with confidence about the earliest Wettins is modest. They appear in the 10th century among the elite of East Saxony, operating inside a tight network of kinship, where counts, margraves, and bishops were connected through blood, marriage, and political patronage. The family's earliest environment was not a wealthy heartland, but a northeastern border zone shaped by conquest, settlement, and cultural friction. It was a region distant from older centres of literacy and stone building, but it offered rare mobility. In frontier societies, danger can be a ladder. The land that later became their core had its own deep background. After the turmoil of late antiquity, the region between major rivers and forest belts saw new settlement waves. Over time, Slavic-speaking communities spread into favourable valleys and river plains, gradually pushing into wooded zones. West of this frontier, Frankish power strengthened, bringing Christianity, writing, and monetary exchange. East of it, these features arrived later and unevenly. The border was not a neat line. It was a contested zone where raids, tribute, and shifting claims were normal. The balance shifted decisively under the early German kings. Fortresses were stormed, strongholds were founded on commanding heights, and conquered territories were reorganized under delegated officials. Marches were created as military administrative zones, ruled by margraves with wide powers and income rights, designed to impose royal authority on recently subdued peoples. Church organization followed. An archbishopric and new dioceses were established to anchor conquest to institutions and to deepen integration through Christianization. Smaller fortified districts were also used to spread control locally, requiring local populations to provide service and garrisons. Revolts could shatter this system. In the north, a major uprising erased royal control for generations. In the south and southeast, integration continued, and that difference mattered. It meant the area where the Wettins would rise remained under stronger imperial influence, even while the broader frontier remained unstable. In the late 10th and early 11th centuries, margraves on this frontier could wield power that resembled that of dukes. In theory, they acted as royal deputies. In practice, they governed spaces where rival lords were scarce and royal claims were backed by conquest. They could demand extensive obligations from communities and maintain a substantial armed following because the border required it. Yet this exceptional authority began to weaken as the region became more settled and more normal. Churches, monasteries, and other secular lords gained footholds. The old march system gradually lost its monopoly, and the margrave's dominance narrowed. The Wettins did not begin as outsiders clawing upward from nothing. When their earliest figures appear, they already belong to the ruling milieu. One of them gained a countship with strong patronage support. Another secured rights in a neighbouring district, and from these bases the family expanded landholding around key river corridors. Countships mattered because the office itself increasingly became hereditary in practice, turning a role granted from above into something a family could treat as its own. That shift encouraged a more dynastic mindset and helped the family step out of wider kinship structures into a narrower, more self-conscious house identity. Marriage alliances accelerated their rise. Ties were forged with other March families and with powerful houses beyond Saxony, linking the Wettins into the upper circle of regional magnates. Castles became anchors. One fortress would later give the family its name. Another position pushed them across the old frontier and placed them directly in the zone where future power would be built. They also learned the hard lessons of high politics. Attempts to seize major offices could create lifelong enemies and end in murder. Rivalries around margravial titles were deadly. Royal decisions could bypass them, and in unstable times competitors could remove a potential rival by force. Yet dynastic extinction among rivals could open doors that had seemed permanently closed. When a powerful neighbouring house died out, the Wettins could no longer be ignored. An imperial appointment placed them in a march that mattered. Then came the storms of the 11th century. Saxony erupted in rebellion, and the region became a battleground between kings and magnates. The Wettins sometimes opposed the crown and suffered captivity, loss of office, forced surrender of lands. At other moments they aligned with the king, acted as loyal supporters, and were rewarded with restoration and promotion. Their position could still be swept away by royal choice, as when a margraviate was given to an outside ally after a death. Yet the family endured, and one surviving heir, after a dramatic escape and careful repositioning, regained the office and expanded it further. By the end of the 11th century, a Wettin held not only one march but two, an achievement that made him one of the strongest figures in the region. Closeness to the royal court amplified their reach. A family member could serve as chancellor, become a bishop, influence elections, and anchor the dynasty inside the empire's inner circle. Female relatives could hold powerful religious positions, and marriage links could tie the Wettins into the orbit of a future emperor. These connections did not guarantee stability, but they increased resilience. In a world built on personal ties, proximity to the ruler could be as valuable as land. Still, the apparent grandeur of holding a march concealed a quieter reality. The march system that had once given margraves unmatched authority was dissolving. Rival centres rose inside the frontier. Monasteries, local lords, and new forms of landed rule. The fortified district system weakened. The power of a margrave around 1100 was far less absolute than that of a margrave a century earlier. The frontier was becoming a landscape of competing rights, rather than a single chain of command. That transformation also revealed what would define the next stage of territorial power: intensification. Real dominance came not only from titles but from building a dense base. Castles strengthened in stone, monastic foundations that produced memory and literacy, settlement initiatives that reshaped the land, and later, the promotion of towns. One ambitious lord in the region demonstrated how rapidly a power base could be constructed through these methods, even before receiving high office. His rise showed that effective lordship was shifting from the old language of frontier command toward the new practice of shaping society, attracting settlers, clearing forests, founding institutions, and turning space into structure. The power of a medieval dynasty often depended less on titles than on where its roots could truly take hold. In the Meissen lands, neither Henry I nor his son managed to turn their margravial rank into deep control. Their authority rested largely in the Eastern March, and even there it remained fragile. While they struggled to secure their position, a rival family under Wipprecht steadily expanded its own influence. By the early 12th century, the balance of power in the region had shifted, and the Wettins faced the risk of being overshadowed on ground that was formerly theirs. When Henry I died in 1103, he left only a newborn son. For years, the boy's mother governed the marches in his name, but the chance to build a durable regime slipped away. The young Henry reached adulthood only briefly before dying childless in 1123. With his death, the two marches once again lay open, inviting new contests for supremacy. Within the wider Wettin kin, a junior branch sought opportunity through alliance. Dedo, nephew of an earlier margrave, married Wipprecht's daughter and joined the two strongest houses of the frontier. Inspired by his father-in-law, he planned to found a family monastery near Halle, east of the Saale, a symbolic step toward anchoring power in the landscape. Yet before the project matured, he departed on pilgrimage to the Holy Land and died on the return journey. The union that might have stabilized the region dissolved almost as quickly as it had formed. Meanwhile, relations between the Saxon nobles and the emperor deteriorated once more. After the last Henry's death, the emperor favoured his loyal ally Witprecht and granted him both marches. The Saxon duke rejected the decision and backed a different Wettin candidate for Meissen and an Ascanian for the Eastern March. The elderly Witprecht could not impose himself against this opposition and died in 1124, followed shortly by his imperial patron. The election of a new king from Saxony changed the political climate entirely, and the duke's nominees became the accepted margraves. One branch of the Wettins had thus survived the family's generational crisis and secured at least one march. From the ancestral fortress of Wettin, the dynasty now took the name by which it would be known for centuries. The line that had ruled from Eilenburg disappeared, and the future belonged to the house that traced itself to the Saale stronghold. From this point, the family's history ran in an unbroken chain down to the fall of the Saxon monarchy in the 20th century. The new margrave inherited a complicated landscape. His personal power lay along the middle Saale and in parts of the Eastern March, while the Meissen territory remained contested and fragmented. Building a firm base that required patience and fortune. Later, generations celebrated him as the Great, yet his true achievement was less heroic conquest than careful consolidation that prepared the way for his descendants. Chance favoured him. The rival Witprecht family died out in the male line, allowing the Wettin margrave to reunite scattered holdings. He cultivated the goodwill of the king and spent long periods at court, a strategy that paid off when the Eastern March was returned to him in 1135. Holding both marches at once, he became the dominant figure east of the Saale and one of the stronger princes of the empire. Inheritance brought further gains. Portions of the former Witprecht lands, along with districts around the later Dresden and Bautzen and the advocacy over a rich imperial monastery, came under Wettin control. These acquisitions allowed the dynasty to anchor itself in Meissen, not merely through office but through tangible property and rights. Yet the emperor also planted counterweights, appointing imperial burgraves in key castles to safeguard royal interests. These officials soon developed into regional rivals, and for generations the Wettins had to contend with them before they could fully absorb or neutralize their authority. The margrave also strengthened the family's symbolic presence. Near Halle, he established an Augustinian house, intended as burial place and memorial centre for the new dynasty. His children married into leading houses of the empire and even into the ruling families of Eastern Central Europe. With 5 sons, he overcame the chronic problem of heir shortage that had plagued earlier generations, and a nephew rose to become Archbishop of Magdeburg, one of the most influential churchmen of the age. Yet at the apparent height of his power, the margrave stumbled. In the mid-11th century, he became entangled in a conspiracy against the new emperor. Royal favour vanished, and under pressure he renounced his secular rule and entered his own monastery, dying soon after. His lands were divided among his sons, a fragmentation that weakened the house just as imperial authority was returning vigorously to the frontier. The emperor reclaimed rights, placed districts under royal control, and transferred eastern territories to the Bohemian crown. The Wettins remained powerful, but they now faced a landscape crowded with new competitors. While politics fluctuated, society in the region was undergoing a transformation. From the mid-12th century, the once sparsely settled marches experienced an extraordinary surge of growth. Forests were cleared at remarkable speed, and by around 1,200 settlers had reached even the high slopes of the Erzgebirge. Villages multiplied, towns emerged where only small trading spots had existed, and a network of markets and crafts reshaped daily life. The discovery of rich silver veins in the mountains triggered a mining boom that drew fortune seekers from far and wide and tied the region to wider economic currents. Migrants arrived from across the empire. Farmers, miners, merchants, and craftsmen, along with Jewish traders who played a vital role in finance. The population may have increased many times over. New legal forms, new patterns of settlement, and new social hierarchies developed from this mixture. German language and customs gradually became dominant, and the church expanded with new parishes and monasteries. Within a century, the former frontier stood on roughly equal footing with the older heartlands. This transformation did not occur by itself. Competing lords shaped it through deliberate policy. Colonization, town privileges, and monastic foundations became the chief tools of power. In the southern march, the Margrave, Otto, son of the earlier Conrad, pursued large clearing projects and promoted key towns such as Dresden, Leipzig, and especially Freiburg, whose silver deposits soon made him one of the wealthiest princes of his time. He founded a Cistercian abbey as a dynastic centre within his own domain, distancing himself from the older family monastery controlled by his brothers. His brother Dedo ruled neighbouring districts and also created a religious house to anchor his branch of the family. Although his colonization efforts were more modest, he gained the Eastern March and extended Wettin influence further. Other brothers held the ancestral areas along the Saale, but these zones offered fewer opportunities and gradually lagged behind. By the close of the 12th century, the Wettins dominated much of the former marches, yet their unity had fractured into competing lines. The founding of multiple family monasteries symbolized both prestige and rivalry. Meanwhile, bishops, lesser lords, and newly created imperial officials carved out their own spheres. The emperor established a large royal territory, centered on Altenburg and stretching toward the mountains, staffed by ministerial administrators and protected by burgraves. This new bloc challenged the Wettins' preeminence and reasserted imperial presence in the east. Fortune again turned in their favour in the 13th century. Through inheritance and patient politics, a single Wettin ruler gathered most branches back under one hand. The pledge of the imperial territory as a dowry for a dynastic marriage allowed them gradually to absorb it. When the Thuringian Landgravate fell vacant, a long succession war ended with Wettin victory, giving them hegemony across central Germany on both sides of the Saale. By the mid-13th century, the house stood among the foremost princes of the realm, and the voluntary partition of their vast lands among heirs was itself a sign of confident sovereignty. Far to the northwest, another political landscape unfolded under Welf rule. The regions between the Harz and the Baltic formed a patchwork of Loessy plains, heathlands, and coastal zones. Braunschweig and Lüneburg acted as twin centres, one surrounded by rich monastic life, the other by saltworks and trade routes to the sea. Here the decades after the fall of Henry the Lion did not represent a sharp break. His family remained influential, even producing an emperor, and in 1235 their possessions were elevated to a duchy named after the two towns that anchored their heterogeneous realm. Population growth continued here as well. Mining prospered around Goslar, new fields were opened on the fertile soils, and in the coastal areas, settlers built dikes to reclaim land from the sea, sometimes with disastrous consequences when storms overwhelmed the fragile barriers. Villages evolved from clusters of farms into communities, with defined rights, collective management of fields, and parish churches at their heart. Social differentiation deepened. Cottagers without land lived beside prosperous reeves, who managed lordly affairs and gradually secured their own status. Noble families sought greater independence, and after 1180 the Welfs lacked the ducal prerogatives that had once allowed Henry the Lion to dominate them. Some houses built near closed territories of their own, while others expanded along the edges of Welf power. Princes and lesser lords alike aimed to round out possessions, assert rights as broadly as possible, and document claims in writing. Administrative practice advanced, though full account books remained rare and monasteries often led the way in record keeping. In the 13th century, power in northern Germany did not run only through formal titles. It ran through relationships. A noble's standing was often measured by visibility at a ruler's court, by personal bonds of service, and by who showed up when a duke called. Yet this was also an age when the great ducal house in the region could appear politically weaker on the wider imperial stage, and that weakness created space. Local dynasties, even smaller ones, learned to act more boldly, more independently, and with growing confidence. The earlier style of rule associated with Henry the Lion had pursued dominance so aggressively that many remembered it as heavy-handed. Over time, that approach loosened rather than strengthened the cohesion of the north. Once the old ducal framework fractured, noble families found ways to turn the looseness of the political landscape into opportunity. Church lords played a decisive role in that shifting balance. The leading noble families held many of the key church posts in cathedral chapters, and in major cities the urban elite would only slowly break into those circles much later. Some bishops and archbishops expanded their influence after the old ducal order was dismantled, especially where older obligations and contested grants began to be questioned and reversed. As older forms of lordship weakened, bishops could demand the return of rights that had been taken over or held on shaky grounds. Their strategy did not look radically different from that of lay princes. They sought strong points, built or captured castles, tightened control over territory, and encouraged local consolidation. Cathedral chapters also strengthened their position, and as episcopal elections became more firmly tied to those chapters, the regional nobility gained an even stronger hand inside the church principalities. The Welf rulers themselves had already understood the importance of towns before the duchy broke apart. Under Henry the Lion, places like Göttingen and Lübeck were fostered as engines of influence. Even when castles remained important, the political gravity of the region increasingly leaned toward urban centres. In Braunschweig and Lüneburg especially, ducal authority was anchored not only in fortifications, but also in religious institutions that carried prestige, memory, and legitimacy. In Braunschweig, a collegiate church became a stage for sacred display and dynastic ambition, enriched with relics and public symbolism. Later, Welf generations favoured a major religious foundation at Lüneburg, which also became a burial focus for one branch of the family and helped bind the dynasty to the town. After 1180, other nobles followed similar patterns, though more slowly. Castle building expanded and changed character. Fortresses increasingly appeared in lowland settings and became administrative magnets, rather than only military shelters. Many families began to take their names from their principal strongholds, turning a building into an identity. Lesser nobles and ministerial families strengthened their homes as well, raising fortified mounds and enclosed sites that signalled permanence. Alongside these residences came monasteries. Families founded religious houses as burial sites and memory institutions, joining stone strongholds with cloisters to create small regional cores of authority. The urban landscape also changed rapidly. Around 1180, the number of towns in the region was still limited. Soon afterward, a wave of smaller foundations began. This expansion was driven less by kings and more by counts and mid-ranking dynasties who wanted markets, judges, toll points, workshops, and reliable administrative nodes within their own spheres. A new town meant an economic centre and a governance tool at once. Regular markets drew artisans and traders, craft specialisation expanded, and the presence of local courts increased predictability and security. These places pulled people in from the surrounding countryside, and migration became one of the most visible marks of town life. Monasteries, especially those known for disciplined management, moved into towns as well, buying or building urban bases in order to sell products and participate in the cash economy that towns made possible. Yet not all towns grew into the same kind of power. Braunschweig and Lüneburg became the two giants of the wealth heartland, but they evolved differently. Braunschweig emerged from multiple settlement cores clustered around a river crossing. Over time, these separate quarters gained privileges, representation, and defensive rights, and their councils learned how to coordinate. Rulers granted concessions to merchants, including far-reaching freedoms in long-distance trade, and these privileges helped transform the city into a dominant economic actor in its regional network. Political autonomy advanced slowly and unevenly, yet the town's economic weight steadily increased until it could stand alongside the leading commercial cities of the north. Lüneburg's story carried a different tension. The town remained more tightly bound to ducal control, but its wealth created leverage. Salt and related resources were managed in ways that allowed collective urban influence to grow. Even when the dukes kept a firm grip, town representatives found room to maneuver by controlling the very economic arteries on which ducal finances depended. Beyond these inland centres stood Lübeck, whose role was larger than regional politics. Its position as a transfer hub on the Baltic routes gave it international reach. Shifts in overlordship around the city did not prevent it from building its own authority. The city learned to exploit political change to strengthen internal self-rule and to expand its presence across the Western Baltic. Eventually, royal recognition of Lübeck's autonomy confirmed what practice had already created, a major urban power governed by its own council, answering directly upward rather than through a regional lord. As long-distance trade expanded, merchants formed wider associations to protect routes, standardize practices, and defend privileges. Over time, these commercial networks became a recognizable force. Urban leaders also pushed into social welfare and religious life, founding hospitals and institutions that were increasingly run under civic authority rather than purely clerical control. Across the 13th century, many towns saw their councils grow from local administrators into bodies with a sense of corporate identity and political ambition. All of this development also sharpened social differences, feuds, courtly display, dowries, inheritance divisions, castle building, and the desire to maintain a dignified household often outpaced what land revenues could reliably support. Even careful management could not always cover the costs of status. Debt became a structural feature of noble life. Town merchants increasingly served as creditors to lords and princes. Jewish communities in several towns also participated significantly in lending and finance, becoming part of the economic machinery that kept noble households running. Land was mortgaged, income streams were pledged, and the cash economy tightened its grip on aristocratic politics. In a region where kings rarely appeared after the great imperial power struggles of the age, Dynastic marriages and regional alliances became the main gears of political action. Farther northeast, along the southwestern Baltic coast, a different kind of transformation unfolded. Two lordly houses, one in Mecklenburg and one in Pomerania, rose within a zone that entered the empire later and remained distant from its traditional centres. The region's ruling elites and many of its inhabitants were originally Slavic and pagan, and lasting Christianization was still a relatively recent process. That late conversion and peripheral position shaped how these lordships became imperial princes. Early on, external pressure defined the field. Denmark and Saxony competed for influence in the west, while Poland and Brandenburg pulled at the east. Attempts to project authority into these lands often relied on personal placements and negotiated dependence rather than deep administrative control. In Pomerania, local rulers shifted between stronger neighbours, sometimes leaning toward Poland, sometimes toward the German kingdom, sometimes toward Denmark, depending on which alliance promised survival. Missionary activity accompanied this political tug-of-war, and conversion became tied to protection, diplomacy, and legitimacy. In the western area that would become Mecklenburg, a Slavic confederation gradually turned into a new lordship under Saxon pressure. A local ruler emerged whose authority was increasingly linked to a central stronghold, and a regional identity formed around it. Christian institutions were established, a bishopric was endowed, and a monastery founded that would later serve as a marker of dynastic and territorial consolidation. The ruling family cultivated ties to the Saxon ducal house, even marrying into its extended circle, though the gap in rank remained visible. Loyalty brought advantages, but it also reflected dependence. Then, the Great Northern political map shifted when the dominant Saxon duke was deposed. Danish expansion surged during the years of turmoil in the German kingdom, and the Baltic coast was drawn into a larger sphere of Scandinavian power. Mecklenburg's lords became vassals within this new order and participated in Danish campaigns. Internal rivalries were managed through outside arbitration, and districts were allotted to competing branches. One of the local rulers died during a Danish military expedition, and the remaining lord gained territory as payment for service. At the same time, the wider settlement movement from the west began to push into these lands, bringing new forms of organisation and land use. Despite Danish supremacy, the idea gradually hardened that these regions belonged within the empire's political world. When Denmark's dominance collapsed suddenly after the capture of the Danish king, by a regional count, the negotiated release terms explicitly treated Mecklenburg and Pomerania as lands to be surrendered back into the imperial sphere. A coalition victory soon after ended direct Danish control and forced a new arrangement. That did not mean the emperor stepped in personally as a direct overlord. In Pomerania, imperial policy favoured delegation. The region was placed under Brandenburg's overlordship, and the local dukes were compelled to accept that dependency after conflict. The price was high, territory was lost, succession clauses were imposed, and certain districts slipped away to Mecklenburg-linked lords. Pomerania was briefly reunified when one ducal line died out, then partitioned again later as heirs divided their inheritance. Mecklenburg faced fewer external blows at first, and imperial confirmation of rights strengthened its position. Yet internal vulnerability remained. After the death of a leading lord, the next generation was underage, and regents governed in their name. The lordship was divided among brothers, then divided again, producing several separate districts that followed their own trajectories. Some lines remained strong, others faded, and not all branches achieved the same recognition when higher titles were later granted. Crisis struck again in the late 13th century, when a Mecklenburg ruler was captured during a pilgrimage and held for decades in captivity, far from home. In his absence, regency battles erupted and rival branches competed over authority and the inheritance rights of his sons. One son eventually took control as regent and later as ruler, bringing a firmer hand to a territory that had been close to disintegration. From that point, the Mecklenburg rise was fueled by hard bargains, payments, and military outcomes. A marriage into the Brandenburg ruling house opened a path to reclaim a district long lost, secured through a heavy silver payment and later defended in battle. Treaties fixed the gain, and Mecklenburg expanded again by establishing itself in Rostock after the local line ended. Denmark attempted to reassert influence there, and earlier agreements were invoked to justify claims. Yet Denmark's internal strain and regional rivalry weakened its hand, allowing Mecklenburg to lock in the acquisition through diplomacy, alliances, and the careful timing of peace with a Danish king. A marriage connection reaching into Scandinavian politics strengthened Mecklenburg's position further and helped stabilize the coastal gains. Not every ambition succeeded. Efforts to extend influence into neighboring, contested regions ran into resistance, and rival dynasties sometimes prevailed. In the end, Pomerania succeeded in acquiring strategically important territory that Mecklenburg could not secure, expanding its own reach along the Baltic. The movement of settlers toward the east did more than change maps. It reshaped how the newly Christian rulers along the southwestern Baltic coast governed, presented themselves, and connected to the wider political world. In Mecklenburg and Pomerania, this transformation began while many people in the region still remembered older religious traditions, and it accelerated as new institutions, new legal habits, and new forms of public authority took root. One of the earliest signs of this shift was the way these dynasties began to communicate power on paper. In Pomerania, rulers were already producing charters in the late 12th century that looked and sounded like the documents used by established princes farther west. This was not just a bureaucratic change. It signalled a claim to equal standing, a decision to speak the same political language as older Christian lordships. The close relationship with the church served the same purpose. Dynastic monasteries were founded as spiritual anchors and as public statements of legitimacy. In Mecklenburg, Doberan became a focal point of that identity. In Pomerania, a comparable foundation played a similar role. These were places of worship, memory, burial, and administration all at once, helping new Christian elites appear familiar to the broader aristocratic world. Symbols mattered as much as institutions. Seals became a standard tool of authority, and soon heraldic imagery followed. In Pomerania, the griffin emerged as a defining emblem by the early 13th century and remained so strongly associated with the dynasty that the family itself became known through that beast. Mecklenburg's heraldic story overlapped at first. A griffin appeared there too around the beginning of the 13th century, before a bull's head became the more enduring sign for the main Mecklenburg line. Even after that transition, the griffin continued to live on in regional memory, through related branches and territories connected to the Mecklenburg sphere. What these emblems reveal is not mere decoration, but a deliberate effort to join the visual culture of noble rule in Christian Europe. As the 13th century progressed, the texture of court life becomes clearer. Evidence appears for recognizable household offices, showing that rulers were building courts that functioned in a familiar Western way. Mecklenburg begins to reveal a steward, then a marshal, then other roles that cluster around a princely household, including people responsible for chambers and ceremonial service. Pomerania shows similar structures even earlier indicating a rapid adoption of courtly norms. By the 14th century, narrative accounts paint a fuller picture. Weddings turn into major political and social events, and feasts become demonstrations of standing. One celebrated marriage in the early 14th century drew crowds of high-ranking guests, and when one town refused to host the gathering, the court simply moved elsewhere, turning the moment into a reminder that princely life could not easily be contained by urban gatekeeping. Another grand wedding later in the century was staged with theatrical scale, including the public making of a knight, a ritual designed to display alliance, honour, and the transfer of status. Marriage itself was one of the most important bridges into the older aristocratic world. Being accepted as a suitable partner mattered as much as armies or castles. In the early period, Mecklenburg's rulers often married either into neighbouring Slavic territories or into circles that did not fully match the level of the highest princes of the empire. That pattern gradually changed. A particularly striking turning point came when Mecklenburg entered into marriages that connected it to Brandenburg, and then to a prestigious Saxon line. These unions did not automatically make Mecklenburg equal in every setting, but they opened doors that had been harder to reach before. Pomerania followed a slightly different path. After key rulers in the 13th century, Pomerania's marriages show a mixture. Ties to Scandinavian royalty, to nearby noble houses, and to Brandenburg. Yet compared with Mecklenburg, Pomerania's marital network remained more tightly centred on the southwestern Baltic zone for longer. The older pool of Polish and Pomeranian connections did not vanish overnight. Over time, however, the balance shifted, and a broader regional aristocratic marketplace emerged, with Brandenburg often sitting at the centre of that web. Marriage was only one half of the story. The other half was the steady multiplication of alliances, truces, and peace agreements. These treaties reveal Mecklenburg and Pomerania becoming actors in a regional system that aimed to reduce violence and regulate conflict. A peace agreement concluded in the late 13th century included not only princes but also towns that were growing into international trading powers, alongside counts and other regional lords. This shows the Baltic coast being drawn into wider efforts to establish order. Most agreements remained local in scope, binding the region together rather than projecting power deep into distant territories. The treaty partners usually came from the immediate neighbourhood. Denmark's role increased in moments when Danish influence expanded, but the densest network formed among the Baltic princes themselves and Brandenburg. Over time, ties also grew with nearby Saxon lines. The lords of Brunswick and Lüneburg, and the counts of Holstein, with Mecklenburg often appearing more frequently in these arrangements than Pomerania. At the start of the 14th century, Mecklenburg's range of action widened noticeably, and after some delay, a leading duke in Pomerania's Stettin branch moved in a similar direction. Later, momentum slowed for a long stretch until renewed changes in imperial politics began to press more strongly on the entire region toward the end of the 15th century. In the earlier phase of widening horizons, one Mecklenburg ruler stands out. Through a high-level marriage connection with Brandenburg, he stepped into a broader political arena. He earned a fearsome reputation by joining a campaign in Bohemia and later fighting far from the Baltic against forces on the North Sea coast. Yet even successful rulers could leave fragile foundations. When he died, he left young heirs, and a council governed in their name for years, illustrating how easily territorial authority could wobble when succession turned uncertain. This was also the moment when Mecklenburg and Pomerania were pulled into the struggle between rival houses for the German crown. The contest mattered for local politics, because Brandenburg itself became a prize. When the old dynasty there died out, the march had no clear master. A new king placed Brandenburg into his own family's hands, and that decision changed the balance for neighbouring rulers. Earlier, the idea had circulated that Pomerania might answer directly to the king as a primary vassal. Once Brandenburg became a dynastic possession of the crown holder, the policy hardened in another direction. Pomeranian rulers were pushed to accept their lands through Brandenburg rather than directly from the king. This pressure triggered predictable reactions. A Pomeranian duke transferred loyalty to the king's most dangerous opponent in the wider conflict. Then, as the king's position shifted, the Stettin branch of Pomerania exploited the moment. At a major assembly, Brandenburg's immediate lordship, claim over Stettin, was relaxed, and the Stettin dukes won the right to hold their territory directly from the empire. In exchange, Brandenburg secured a future fallback, right if the line failed. The outcome was a public statement that Stettin's lands belonged under the empire's umbrella and should answer upward to that authority alone. Elsewhere within Pomerania, another branch was still pressed to seek recognition through Brandenburg, showing that Pomerania did not move as a single unit, and that geography and nearby power mattered. A further realignment came with the rise of a Luxembourg ruler, who proved willing to recognise Pomeranian claims more broadly. In return for support, he acknowledged all Pomeranian dukes as full imperial princes and offered guarantees about inheritance if one line died out. This was a crucial moment because it raised status not merely by local practice but by wider recognition within the empire's hierarchy, and it extended that recognition across the competing Pomeranian branches. Mecklenburg's path to the same kind of elevated recognition ran through a different sequence of choices. One Mecklenburg heir approached the Wittelsbach king early, partly through dynastic planning that reached beyond Germany into Scandinavian politics. But at the same time, links to the Luxembourg side developed, and a brother acted as an intermediary. When the Wittelsbach ruler died, Mecklenburg switched openly, largely because a long-standing goal could not be achieved under Wittelsbach control. Removing Brandenburg's lingering grip over certain Mecklenburg holdings, the Luxembourg ruler moved quickly, confirming Mecklenburg's rights and effectively sweeping away Brandenburg's claims. Soon afterward, he elevated Mecklenburg's ruling house to ducal rank. Other neighbouring princes formally dropped older claims of superiority, and the elevation charter itself spoke through silence about Danish rights, still hanging over certain coastal territories. The omission was meaningful. It signalled that the new dukes wanted recognition without acknowledging outside overlordship that did not fit their new status. Mecklenburg's new standing also became visible in how it exercised authority over others. A grant involving a neighbouring count marked one of the first clear moments where Mecklenburg behaved as a superior lord in a feudal relationship, something that mattered symbolically as much as it mattered politically. War then sharpened these changes. A struggle involving the Luxembourg ruler and the Wittelsbach camp drew in Denmark as well, and Mecklenburg's military success helped produce a treaty in which Brandenburg's remaining claims were finally set aside. By mid-century, Mecklenburg's rulers had become recognised imperial princes in a fully public way, and they retained that status for centuries. While these changes played out on the Baltic edge, another story in the southwest of the empire shows how a principality could be built not from an ancient tribal duchy, but from a newly assembled territory. In the German kingdom of the High Middle Ages, the Zähringer provide a clear example of a ducal title tied to a constructed power base, rather than to one of the traditional great provinces. Their identity took its name from a castle near Freiburg, and the dynasty grew out of a prominent Swabian noble family. A related branch formed the Margraves of Baden, illustrating how one noble stock could send out different political lines with different fates. The memory of the Zähringer did not remain constant across the centuries. It flared again much later when dynastic genealogy became fashionable among powerful houses, then attracted early modern historians who were interested in noble origins and continuity. In the modern age, scholars argued over what made the Zähringer distinctive, sometimes presenting them as pioneers of a new style of territorial rule. Whatever label is used, one fact remains. Freiburg sits at the centre of the Zähringer story, not only because they founded it, but because it became a key place of residence for the last duke and the site where his memory was anchored. The Zähringer beginnings lead back to the late 10th and 11th centuries, when the family ranked among Swabia's leading nobles. They held comital rights, cultivated close ties to emperors, and were influential enough to make credible bids for the Duchy of Swabia itself. At first, those bids did not succeed. One prominent Berthold had to accept a different ducal title instead, in Carinthia, showing both the family's prestige and the limits of its leverage. Then the turmoil of the investiture contest fractured loyalties throughout the empire. In that crisis, Berthold's son gained the Swabian ducal title within the anti-royal camp through marriage alliance and political positioning, in direct opposition to the Staufen Duke installed by the king. That Swabian split did not last forever. A settlement mediated by the king ended the clash. The Zähringer leader gave up the claim to Swabia, but the trade was not trivial. He received a major urban strongpoint as a royal grant and, more importantly, carved out effective control over western Swabia along the Upper Rhine. Over the 12th century, this zone became a recognizable ducal land under Zähringer authority. Local nobles increasingly appeared in the Zähringer orbit rather than in the assemblies of the older Swabian dukes. From the Staufen point of view, this was an encroachment, and resentment persisted for generations. Contemporary voices mocked the Zähringer ducal title as empty, a rhetorical attack meant to deny that the Zähringer possessed a real duchy. Yet tension was not only verbal. At moments, armed conflict flared, and later emperors worked to keep Zähringer alliances from becoming too strong, blocking church appointments and encouraging dynastic separations that weakened Zähringer coalitions. Zähringer rule in the southwest relied on building networks as much as holding titles. They gathered counts and lesser nobles into their circle, and they used service families as administrators and castle keepers. Over time, however, some nobles who had once been close to the Zähringer drifted toward the Staufen side, a reminder that loyalty in the Middle Ages could shift with advantage. Religious institutions could become gathering points for opposition as well as support, especially when noble groups sought places that symbolized independence from ducal dominance. More than personal bonds, three instruments shaped Zähringer control: castles, monasteries, and towns. These three elements formed a triangle of authority. The original castle gave the dynasty its name and remained a powerful symbol, even when newer castles were built on a grander scale. A family monastery in the Black Forest became the spiritual core of the principality, a place of burial, memory, and continuous prayer for the dynasty and its supporters. Gifts from vassals flowed to it. Nearby churches were founded in its orbit, and members of service families entered its monastic life. In practical terms, it also mattered because the dukes exercised protective authority over it and over other religious foundations, using that role to project secular influence into ecclesiastical space. The Zähringer also sought influence through control of reform monasteries. especially those that opened and organized sparsely settled landscapes. As monastic institutions expanded land use, settlement, and local administration, the power of whoever held protective rights over them expanded too. Disputes over who possessed those rights could become long and bitter, because the prize was not merely ceremonial. It was access to a growing frontier of people, dues, and authority.